Thank you for joining in today's Cryptid horror stories. The first story today is called The Living Storm, and this is a horror story about Raiju. And in this story, a remote, high-end corporate retreat in the Japanese Alps, built with avant-garde glass and steel. The weather forecast predicts a historic supercell storm. The Raiju doesn't just arrive with the rain, it is the storm. The creature manifests not as a beast in the woods, but as a living electrical surge. The second story today is called The Cistern's Tithe, and this is a horror story about the Monaciello. And in this story, in a decaying, ancestral palazzo in the heart of Naples, owned by the Moretti family, the family is struggling financially. The youngest daughter, Isabelle, discovers an old family diary mentioning the Monaciello. According to the lore, if you treat the spirit well, it brings gold. If you ignore it, it takes. The family, desperate for money, decides to invite the spirit in by leaving offerings of food and coins near the basement cistern. In the description below, the stories have been timestamped. Also, don't forget to hit the like and subscribe button so you don't miss the stories yet to come. Now for today's cryptid horror stories, I hope you all enjoy. The Living Storm. The dead light bulb hung from the ceiling like a small, frosted eye, and Daniel Cho stared at it with the kind of attention that a man gives to something that is about to kill him. He was not afraid of the dark. He was 37 years old, a senior project manager at Taniguchi Cybernetics, and he had been sitting in this conference room on the 14th floor of the company's flagship retreat facility for the past 20 minutes, waiting for a presentation that was now 12 minutes late, and the light bulb above him had died with a small, decisive pop that he had felt more than heard. The fluorescent tube had gone brown at the ends, and the room had dropped into a gray half-light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out onto the Japanese Alps, and Daniel had noticed something that had nothing to do with the bulb. The hairs on his arms were standing straight up. Not the way they stand when you are cold, which is a rough, inconsistent bristle, each follicle fighting its own private war against the temperature. No, these were standing perfectly, uniformly vertical, as though each one had been individually erected by a precise, invisible hand. And they were vibrating. He could feel them buzzing against the fabric of his dress shirt, a faint, high-frequency tremor that was less like a physical sensation and more like a sound that he was hearing through his skin. He held his forearm up and looked at it. The hairs stood like a field of dark wires, trembling. He passed his other hand over them and felt the static snap against his palm, a cluster of tiny, sharp pinpricks that made his fingertips tingle. He rubbed his thumb and forefinger together and heard the crackle. The air tasted like pennies and ozone, the sharp, metallic tang of something burned, something electrical, something that had no business being in a climate-controlled, hermetically sealed, state-of-the-art corporate retreat that had cost Taniguchi Cybernetics the equivalent of a small nation's GDP to build. Daniel stood up slowly. The chair rolled back on its casters with a small squeak that sounded obscenely loud in the silence, because the silence was wrong. He knew this the way a sailor knows the sea is wrong before the storm, the way an animal knows to flee before the ground shakes. The silence was not the absence of sound. It was the displacement of sound. It was the silence that happens right before a lightning strike, that heavy, pressurized emptiness that descends on the world when all the ambient sound has been sucked upward into the building charge of the atmosphere. It was the silence of potential, of energy compressed to its breaking point, and it pressed against his eardrums like a hand cupped over each ear. He walked to the window. The sky outside was a cloudless, brilliant blue, the kind of blue that only exists at altitude in the thin, clean air of the mountains, where the atmosphere is sparse enough that the sky looks not like a ceiling but like a depth, an infinite, vertiginous blue that seems to pull you upward. There were no clouds. There was no storm. There was nothing in the sky except that terrible, beautiful clarity and the jagged white teeth of the Alps reaching up into it. Daniel pressed his forehead against the glass and looked down. The retreat was built on a plateau above a valley, a long, flat shelf of rock and scrub pine that ended in a cliff that dropped 600 meters into a river gorge. The building itself was an avant-garde masterpiece of glass and brushed steel and exposed concrete, designed by the Danish architect Freya Lund, who had been profiled in Architectural Digest, and who had once described the building as a conversation between human geometry and mountain geology. It was all right angles and transparency. A structure that seemed to have been extruded from the rock rather than built upon it. And it was, Daniel knew, one of the most technologically sophisticated buildings in East Asia. It had its own microgrid, a redundant power system, a lightning protection array that was rated for a direct strike from a Category 5 thunderstorm, and a grounding system so elaborate that the engineering documentation ran to 400 pages. And yet the air tasted like pennies and ozone, and the silence was crushing, and the hairs on his arms were vibrating. Daniel pulled out his phone. The screen was dead, not off, not out of battery, dead. The glass was dark, the pixels inert, as though the device had been drained of something more fundamental than electricity. He pressed the power button and held it. Nothing. He pressed it again. Nothing. The phone was a paperweight. He looked around the conference room. The long table was set for the presentation, 8 tablets in their charging docks, a projector mounted to the ceiling, a smart whiteboard that covered one wall, and a tray of bottled water and tiny, expensive sandwiches that no one had touched. The tablets were all dark. The smart whiteboard was dark. The projector was dark. Every electronic device in the room was dead. Daniel walked to the door and pulled it open. The hallway beyond was lit by the emergency lighting system, long, red strips of LED embedded in the floor, casting the corridor in a dim, arterial glow that made the white walls look pink and the steel doorframes look black. The red light was supposed to come on only when the main power failed, and the main power had not failed, or at least, Daniel had not heard it fail, had not heard the generators kick in, had not heard any of the sounds that should accompany a power transfer. The red light was just there, as though it had always been there, as though the building had been bleeding from its baseboards all along and no one had noticed. He stepped into the hallway. The carpet was thick and soundless. The air was still, that same pressurized, metallic stillness. He looked left, toward the main atrium and the grand staircase that spiraled down through the center of the building. He looked right, toward the guest quarters and the executive suites. There was no one. The retreat housed 47 people this weekend, Taniguchi's entire international leadership team, plus support staff, plus the catering crew, plus the 2 security guards, and Daniel could not see or hear a single one of them. He started walking toward the atrium. His shoes made no sound on the carpet. The red floor lights stretched ahead of him like a runway, and as he walked, he noticed that the lights were not steady. They pulsed, not in the regular, rhythmic pulse of a designed emergency system, but in an irregular, stuttering flicker that reminded him of something, a heartbeat, maybe, or the cadence of breath. The lights would hold steady for 3 or 4 seconds, then flicker rapidly, then go dark for a half-second, then come back. Each time they flickered, the hairs on his arms surged, the vibration intensifying, and he could feel the static in the air crackle against his face like the brush of 1,000 tiny, electrified fingers. He reached the atrium. It was a vast, open space, 5 stories high, walled in glass on 3 sides with the staircase spiraling down its center like the spine of some enormous, elegant animal. The glass walls showed the mountains and the valley and the sky, that same impossible, cloudless blue, but the glass was not clean. Daniel squinted. The exterior of the glass was covered in a fine, geometric pattern of condensation, not the random fog of humidity, but a precise, fractal pattern of ice crystals that spread across the panes in branching, lightning-like forks. He had seen this pattern before. It was the pattern that lightning makes when it strikes glass, the Lichtenberg figure, the frozen record of an electrical discharge branching through a dielectric material. But no lightning had struck the building. The sky was clear. He leaned over the railing of the atrium and looked down. The ground floor was visible 5 stories below. The lobby, with its polished concrete floor and its reception desk, and its enormous minimalist sculpture of brushed aluminum that was supposed to represent the intersection of technology and nature. The sculpture was glowing. Not lit from outside, glowing from within, a faint, blue-white radiance that pulsed in time with the red floor lights, as though the building had a single, hidden heartbeat that animated all its surfaces. Daniel gripped the railing to lean further, and the railing shocked him. Not a static shock, a real, driving, muscular shock that locked his hand around the steel and sent a jolt up his arm that made his shoulder convulse and his teeth clack together. He ripped his hand free and stumbled back, and the imprint of his fingers on the railing glowed blue for a moment before fading, like a handprint in hot metal. He stood in the hallway, breathing hard, his hand throbbing, and he understood something. Not fully, not in words, but in the animal part of his brain, the part that had noticed the silence and the taste and the vibrating hairs. He understood that the building was not broken. The building was occupied. The retreat had been Daniel's idea. He had proposed it to Taniguchi himself, in the corner office on the 42nd floor of the Tokyo headquarters, sitting across from a man who was 81 years old and who still ran his company with the focused, quiet intensity of a samurai tending a garden. Daniel had shown him the numbers, the strategic plan, the market analysis, the competitor matrix. He had shown him the retreat facility, the one that Taniguchi had built 3 years ago, and that had never been used for its intended purpose, because Taniguchi believed, correctly, that the most important decisions should be made in beautiful isolation. Daniel had argued that the leadership team needed to be removed from the city, from the noise, from the constant, grinding pressure of quarterly earnings and press cycles, and placed in an environment where they could think clearly and plan boldly. Taniguchi had looked at him for a long time with those dark, still eyes, and then he had said, "The mountains have a way of clarifying things, but they also have a way of revealing what is hidden. You must be prepared for both, Daniel-san." Daniel had not understood what the old man meant. He had thought it was a koan, a piece of corporate zen, the kind of gnomic utterance that Taniguchi was famous for and that the business press interpreted as profound wisdom. He had smiled and bowed and left the office feeling that he had accomplished something. Now, standing in the red-lit hallway of the retreat with his hand throbbing and the taste of ozone on his tongue, he thought he might be beginning to understand. He moved toward the staircase. He did not touch the railing this time. He descended the spiral, his hand hovering an inch above the steel, and as he went down he felt the air change. It grew warmer, not cooler, which was wrong. Heat rises, and the atrium should have been warmer at the top than the bottom. But the lower he went, the warmer the air became, and the stronger the ozone taste, and the more intense the vibration in the hairs on his arms. By the time he reached the 2nd floor, his shirt was damp with sweat, and the air had a texture, a faint, gritty resistance as though it were filled with something too fine to see. He heard a sound. It was not a sound he could identify. It was not mechanical, not human, not animal. It was a low, deep hum that seemed to come from the walls themselves, from the steel and the glass and the concrete, a vibration that was more felt than heard, the way you feel the bass at a concert in your chest and your teeth. The hum was rhythmic. It rose and fell in a slow, regular cycle, and Daniel realized with a chill that it was synchronized with the flickering of the red floor lights. The building was pulsing. The building was resonating. The building was doing something that no building should ever do. He reached the ground floor. The lobby was empty. The reception desk was unmanned. The computer screens were dark. The polished concrete floor reflected the blue glow of the sculpture, and in the reflection, Daniel could see the Lichtenberg figures on the glass walls above, branching and rebranching in their terrible, beautiful symmetry. And then he heard something else. A voice, faint, distant, coming from somewhere to his left from the direction of the dining hall. A woman's voice, low and urgent, speaking in rapid Japanese. He could not make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. It was the tone of someone trying very hard not to scream. Daniel moved toward the voice. The hallway to the dining hall was narrow, walled in exposed concrete, and the red floor lights were brighter here, more insistent, flickering faster. The hum was louder. The air was thicker. He could feel the static against his face, against his scalp, against the backs of his hands, and his hair was standing up not just on his arms but on his head, pulling away from his scalp with a faint, painful tug. The dining hall was a long, elegant room with a single communal table that could seat 50, made of a single slab of black walnut. The table was set for dinner: white linen, crystal glasses, ceramic plates, silverware. Half the meal had been served. Bowls of miso sat cooling, their surfaces undisturbed. Plates of Wagyu beef, still faintly steaming, sat untouched. A bottle of sake had been opened and poured into 8 cups, and only one had been drunk from. The chair at the head of the table was pushed back, the linen napkin thrown to the floor, as though someone had stood up very quickly. 4 people were in the room. Daniel recognized them all. Yuki Tanaka, the CFO, a small, precise woman in her 50s who never raised her voice and never lost her composure, was sitting on the floor behind the table with her back against the wall and her knees drawn up to her chest. Her eyes were wide and dry and fixed on a point in the air above the table, and she was speaking, the voice Daniel had heard, in a low, monotonous drone that was not quite a chant and not quite a prayer. It was a recitation. Daniel caught fragments: Raiju, the thunder beast, Raijan's beast, the lightning that walks. Beside her, James Oduya, the head of international operations, a tall Kenyan man with a shaved head and an easy smile that was nowhere on his face right now, was crouching and holding a carving knife from the table in one hand and his dead phone in the other, turning the phone over and over as though he could coax it back to life by friction. His jaw was clenched so tightly that Daniel could see the muscles working beneath the skin. Across the room, near the door to the kitchen, 2 of the catering staff, a young man and a young woman, both Japanese, both in their 20s, both wearing the black aprons of the retreat's kitchen, were pressed against the wall. The young man was holding the young woman's hand, and they were both staring at the ceiling. Daniel followed their gaze. The ceiling of the dining hall was a smooth, white expanse of acoustic tile, the kind used in commercial buildings to absorb sound. It was not smooth anymore. A pattern was spreading across it, not painted, not projected, but burned into the surface, the way a brand burns into skin. The pattern was a Lichtenberg figure, enormous and complex, its branching arms reaching across the entire ceiling, and at its center, where the branches converged, the tile was glowing. Not with light, with heat. The ceramic was softening, darkening, and a faint, acrid smell of burning mineral filled the room. And within the glow, something moved. Daniel could not describe it afterward, try as he might. It was not a shape. It was not a color. It was a distortion, a ripple in the air, the way heat shimmers above asphalt in summer, but concentrated and deliberate and alive. It moved across the ceiling in a slow, rolling arc, and as it passed over each acoustic tile, the tile blackened and curled and dropped a fine ash onto the table below. The air around it crackled, and the hum in the walls intensified when it moved, and Daniel understood, with that same cold, animal clarity, that the thing on the ceiling was not in the room. It was in the walls. It was in the wiring. It was in the steel and the concrete and the grounding rods that descended 50 meters into the mountain rock, and the shape on the ceiling was merely its shadow, the way a fish's shadow appears on the surface of clear water from far above. It was in the building. It was the building. The Raiju, Yuki said, and her voice was not a whisper but a flat, toneless statement as though she were reading from a balance sheet. The thunder beast, it rides the lightning, it lives in the storm, it enters through the metal, through the wires, through the rods, it is the current, it is the charge. James looked at her. "Yuki, what the hell are you talking about?" She did not look at him. Her eyes were still fixed on the ceiling, on the moving distortion, and her lips moved mechanically, reciting something she had learned as a child, something her grandmother had told her in a farmhouse in Nagano Prefecture, something she had dismissed as folklore and superstition, and the kind of thing that educated women did not believe. "The Raiju is a creature of lightning," she said. "It is the companion of Raijin, the god of thunder. It sleeps in the clouds, and when the storms come, it descends to earth. It can take many forms: a wolf, a cat, a weasel, a ball of fire. But its true form is the current itself. It is the electricity. It does not use the wires, James. It is the wires." The distortion on the ceiling stopped moving. It hung there directly above the center of the table, and Daniel could feel it looking at them. Not with eyes, with attention. With the focused, predatory attention of something that has located its prey and is deciding what to do with it. The lights went out. All of them. The red floor lights, the emergency LEDs, the blue glow of the sculpture in the lobby, all of it simultaneously, as though someone had thrown a master switch. The darkness was total and immediate, and so complete that Daniel could not see his own hand when he held it an inch from his face. The silence that followed was worse than the hum. It was the absolute silence of a sealed tomb, and in that silence Daniel heard something that made his bowels turn to water. A sound, not from the ceiling, not from the walls, from the table, from the metal flatware. Every knife, every fork, every spoon on the long black walnut table began to vibrate. He could hear it, a thin, rising, musical whine, like a tuning fork struck by an invisible hand, growing louder and louder, the pitch climbing higher and higher until it was no longer a sound but a pressure, a physical force that pushed against his eardrums and made his vision blur. The metal was resonating. The metal was singing. And then it stopped. Instantly. The silence returned, and in the silence a new sound, a soft, deliberate click like a switch being thrown, and the lights came back on. Not the red emergency lights, but the main lights, the full, brilliant, white overhead lights of the dining hall, blazing at full power, and in that sudden, blinding illumination, Daniel saw the ceiling. The acoustic tiles were gone. Not destroyed, gone. The entire ceiling had been vaporized, leaving a ragged, smoking hole that opened into the floor above, and through the hole, Daniel could see the conference room where he had been sitting 20 minutes ago, and the dead light bulb, and the long table, and something else, something that had not been there before. A shape standing on the conference table, four-legged, low-slung, covered in fur that was not fur but light, white and blue, crackling, shifting, a pelt of living electricity that threw sparks and shadows in equal measure. It was the size of a large wolf, but it was not a wolf. It was too angular, too sharp, too geometric, as though it had been assembled from the essential idea of a predator rather than born as one. Its eyes were 2 points of blinding, actinic blue, and they were looking down through the hole in the ceiling, looking at Daniel, and Daniel felt something that he had never felt before in his life. He felt recognized. The creature opened its mouth. It did not roar. It did not growl. It discharged. A bolt of lightning, thin and branching and white-hot, leapt from its open jaws straight down through the hole in the ceiling and struck the long walnut table. The table exploded, not into fragments, into plasma. The wood vaporized in a column of blue-white fire that reached from floor to ceiling, and the shockwave threw Daniel backward off his feet, through the air, and into the far wall. He hit the concrete with his back and his head, and the world went briefly, mercifully dark. When his vision returned, he was on the floor. The dining hall was in ruins. The table was a smoking trench of charred wood and melted metal. The air was thick with smoke and ozone and the sharp chemical smell of burned hair. The lights were flickering again, that irregular, pulsing flicker, and in the stuttering illumination he could see James pulling Yuki toward the kitchen door. The 2 catering staff were already gone, fled through the kitchen, their footsteps echoing rapidly away. And the creature. The creature was gone. The hole in the ceiling was there, smoking and ragged, but the shape on the conference table was gone. The lights flickered, and Daniel noticed something that made his blood freeze. Each time the lights flickered off, the darkness lasted less than a second. But in that darkness, in that fraction of a heartbeat, the creature moved. He could not see it move, he could only see the result. The first flicker, it was at the edge of the hole. The second flicker, it was on the floor of the dining hall 10 feet closer. The third flicker, it was at the edge of the ruined table. It was not running. It was not walking. It was blinking, appearing 10 feet closer each time the light strobed, like a figure in a zoetrope, like a stop-motion animation of a predator closing the distance between itself and its prey with mechanical, unhurried precision. Each flicker brought it 10 feet closer. The lights were flickering faster now too, 3 times a second, and the distance was closing with terrifying speed. Daniel scrambled to his feet. His legs were shaking. The floor was vibrating under his shoes. He could feel the current in the concrete, a deep, thrumming pulse that climbed through his soles and into his bones. "Move!" James shouted from the kitchen door, and Daniel ran. He ran without looking back. He ran through the smoke and the heat and the flickering, strobing light, and behind him, with each flicker, he heard a sound that was not a growl and not a bark but a crack, a sharp, explosive crack like a whip the size of a building being snapped in an enclosed space, and the air pressure changed with each crack, popping his ears, making him stagger. He reached the kitchen door, and James grabbed him by the collar and hauled him through, and Yuki slammed the door behind them and James threw the deadbolt. They stood in the kitchen, panting. The kitchen was stainless steel and tile, every surface reflective, and in those reflections Daniel could see the red emergency lights had come back on, pulsing, pulsing. Through the heavy door they heard the creature, not scratching, not clawing, humming. A low electrical hum that vibrated the door in its frame, and Daniel watched the stainless steel surface of the nearest counter ripple, like the surface of a pond into which a stone has been thrown, and he understood. The creature was not trying to break through the door. It was flowing through the wiring behind the door. It was in the walls. It was in the outlets. It was in every conductive surface in the building, and the door was not a barrier. The door was a pathway. "We need to get underground," Yuki said. Her voice was steady now, the recitation finished, the memory of her grandmother's folklore having transformed her from a terrified executive into something harder, something older, something that remembered what the mountains were like before the buildings came. The cellar, the reinforced concrete cellar beneath the north wing. It has no wiring, no metal conduit. The walls are a meter thick. It was built as a safe room. "How do you know that?" James asked. "I read the building plans," Yuki said, "because I approved the budget, because that is what I do. Now move." They moved. Through the kitchen, through the service corridor, past the walk-in freezer where the air was cold and still, and the lights were off, past the laundry room where the industrial washing machines were vibrating in their moorings, humming in sympathy with the building's pulse, past the maintenance room where the fuse boxes were arcing and spitting, and the air was blue with electrical fire. The service corridor was narrow and concrete and felt, for the first time, like it might actually protect them. The red floor lights were absent here. The service corridors had plain, industrial lighting, and it was off, and they moved by the light of James's lighter, a small, trembling flame that threw their shadows long and wavering against the walls. They reached the stairwell to the north wing cellar. It was a heavy, steel door-marked safe room in both English and Japanese, with a manual wheel lock that required no electricity. James spun the wheel and pulled the door open, and behind it was a flight of concrete stairs descending into darkness. They went down. The cellar was exactly as Yuki had described. A reinforced concrete box, windowless, with walls a meter thick, a ceiling of solid concrete and a floor of poured stone. There were no electrical outlets, no wiring, no metal conduit. The only metal was the door itself and the wheel lock. The room was cold and dry and smelled of concrete dust, and it was already occupied. There were 9 people in the cellar. the 2 catering staff who had fled ahead of them, 3 more catering staff, 2 of the cleaning crew, and 2 men Daniel did not recognize at first, until one of them stepped forward and he realized it was Kobayashi, the retreat's facilities manager, a quiet, middle-aged man who wore the same expressionless face every day and who Daniel had never once spoken to beyond a polite nod. The other man was older, perhaps 60, dressed not in the retreat staff uniform but in the rough, practical clothing of a mountain villager, a heavy jacket, work boots, a wool cap. His face was weathered and dark, and his eyes were the eyes of a man who has seen something he never wanted to see and who has been waiting with a terrible patience for it to happen again. "Kobayashi," Daniel said, "what's happening?" Kobayashi looked at him, and for a moment his expressionless face cracked, and behind it Daniel saw something that terrified him more than the creature in the ceiling. He saw a man who had been expecting this, who had known, who had perhaps always known. "The storm is coming," Kobayashi said. "There is no storm," James said. "The sky is clear." Kobayashi looked at the older man. The older man shook his head slowly and said, in accented but precise English, "The sky is clear now, but the storm is already here. It came inside, through the lightning rods, through the grounding wires. It has been in the building since before the sun rose." Daniel stared at him. "Who are you?" "My name is Goro," the old man said. "I am the groundskeeper. I have been the groundskeeper of this mountain for 30 years. My father was the groundskeeper before me, and his father before him. We do not maintain the grounds, Mr. Cho. We watch for this." He gestured upward, toward the ceiling, toward the building above them, toward the thing that was moving through its walls like blood through veins. "We call it the Raiju," Goro said, "and it is not hunting for food." Goro sat on the cold, concrete floor of the cellar with his legs crossed and his hands on his knees, and he spoke in the steady, unhurried cadence of a man who had rehearsed this speech many times in his head and who had hoped, with each passing year, that he would never have to deliver it. The 12 other people in the cellar sat or stood around him in the dark. The only light was a small, battery-powered lantern that Kobayashi had retrieved from a storage shelf, and its yellow glow made the concrete walls look like the walls of a cave, which, Daniel thought, was exactly what they were. "The Raiju is not an animal," Goro said. "It is not a spirit. It is not a god, though it has been called a god's pet. The best word for it is a force, like gravity, like magnetism. It exists in the space between the sky and the earth, in the charge that builds in the clouds and discharges to the ground. When the conditions are right, when the storm is large enough, when the charge is great enough, the Raiju condenses out of the lightning the way ice condenses out of water. It takes shape. It takes will. It takes hunger." He paused. The lantern flickered and everyone flinched and Goro did not. "It does not eat flesh. It does not eat blood. It eats the spark that animates living things. The Japanese have a word for it, iki, the breath of life. The Raiju feeds on iki. When it touches a living thing with its current, it does not burn it. It drains it. The body remains, but the spark is gone. What is left is—" He stopped. He looked at the floor. "What?" Daniel said. "What is left is ash," Goro said. "Not burned ash, drained ash. The body has been emptied of the energy that holds its cells together. It falls apart. It becomes a pile of fine gray powder like the ash of a cremation, but cold. There is no heat. The Raiju takes everything. The heat, the light, the life. It leaves only the dust." Silence. The lantern hummed, a faint, insectal whine. Daniel could feel the concrete floor vibrating under his feet, a deep, distant tremor like the heartbeat of the mountain itself, and he knew it was not the mountain. It was the thing above them, moving through the building's skeleton, feeding. "How many people are still up there?" James asked. His voice was rough, the easy confidence stripped away, leaving something raw and hard underneath. He still held the carving knife, and his knuckles were white around the handle. 47 were registered for the retreat," Daniel said. "Minus the 12 of us here. That's 35. Not 47, Kobayashi said quietly. 39, 8 people did not arrive. Their flights were delayed. I had the manifest. 39 minus 12, Daniel said. 27. Fewer now, Goro said, and he said it with the gentle, terrible finality of a man closing a ledger. It has been in the building for 3 hours. It has been feeding. The number hung in the air. No one spoke. The young catering woman, her name was Mika, Daniel learned later, began to cry, not loudly but in a thin, shuddering gasp that she pressed into the shoulder of the young man beside her, whose name was Takeshi and whose hand had not left hers since the dining hall. "What do we do?" Daniel asked. He asked it directly, the way he asked questions in boardrooms, clearly, efficiently, expecting an answer. Goro looked at him. The old man's eyes were dark and steady, and there was something in them that Daniel recognized, the look of a man who has already calculated the cost and is deciding whether to share it. "The Raiju is agitated by the storm," Goro said. "But the storm is not in the sky. The storm is in the building. The creature has brought the storm with it inside the wires, inside the metal. It is charging itself. Every time it feeds, every time it takes a person's spark, the energy is absorbed into its body. It grows. It becomes more solid, more physical, more present." "You said it's a force," Daniel said. "A force that condenses out of lightning. So what happens when it's fully charged, when it's taken enough?" Goro's face did not change. "Then it does not need the wires anymore. It can move on its own. It becomes solid, real, permanent. A wolf of lightning that walks the earth, and it will not stop feeding until the storm breaks." "How does the storm break?" Yuki asked. She was sitting against the wall with her knees drawn up, and her voice was calm, analytical, the voice of a CFO dissecting a quarterly report. "You said the Raiju is agitated by the storm but dormant in the clear, if the sky is clear." "The sky is clear," Goro said, "but the storm is inside. The storm will not break until the energy is discharged, until the Raiju is grounded, dispersed, returned to the earth." "How?" Goro did not answer immediately. He looked at the lantern, at its small, trembling flame, and Daniel saw something in the old man's expression that he had not expected to see. Not fear, not despair, but calculation. Goro was thinking. He was running numbers, the same way Yuki ran numbers, the same way Daniel ran numbers, and the numbers he was running were the odds of survival in a building that had become the body of a god's pet. "The building has a fire suppression system," Goro said. "A foam-based system for chemical and electrical fires. It is in the main corridors and the central atrium. The foam is a non-conductive chemical compound, a fluoroprotein foam. It is designed to smother electrical fires by cutting off the oxygen and insulating the fuel from the charge." Daniel understood. He understood with a sudden vertiginous clarity that made his pulse spike. "If we can coat the creature, coat the building in the foam, we can insulate it, cut off the current, disperse the charge." "You can insulate yourself," Goro said. "The foam does not kill the Raiju. Nothing kills the Raiju, but it breaks the connection. The Raiju perceives the world through electricity, through the conductive paths that carry its current. If you coat yourself in a non-conductive layer, you disappear from its perception. You become invisible, not to its eyes, it has no eyes, but to its sense. Its electrical sense. Like a shark that can no longer smell blood in the water." "But the foam system is upstairs," Kobayashi said. "In the corridors. It is triggered by the fire alarm, which is electronic, which is—" "Dead," James finished. "Everything electronic is dead. The Raiju is in the wiring." "Not dead," Goro said. "Occupied. The system is not dead. It is part of the creature. But the fire suppression foam tanks are pressurized with nitrogen, not electricity. The release valves are mechanical, triggered by heat-sensitive links that melt at a specific temperature. If you can reach the tanks and manually open the release valves." "Then the foam floods the corridor," Daniel said. "And you coat yourself in it," Goro said, "and you walk out." The plan was simple. The plan was insane. Daniel looked at James, and James looked at Daniel, and between them passed the silent, shorthand communication of two men who had spent their careers in high-pressure situations, and who understood, without needing to say it, that the next words out of their mouths would be the most important words they had ever spoken. "I'll go," Daniel said. "No," James said, "I'll go." "You have a knife. I have nothing. That makes me lighter and faster. And I know the building layout. I designed the retreat itinerary. I have the floor plans memorized. I know where the foam tanks are." James stared at him. The knife trembled in his hand. "Daniel, the thing is in the walls. It is the walls." "I know." "Then how the hell do you?" "The foam tanks are in the service corridor on the ground floor, east wing. The corridor is concrete. No wiring. No metal conduit. It's a fire-rated corridor. The building code requires it to be non-combustible. If I stay in the fire-rated corridors, I should be." "You should." James shook his head. "That's not good enough." "Nothing is good enough," Daniel said, "but it's what we have." Goro reached into his jacket and pulled out something that Daniel did not expect. A small, hand-drawn map, creased and yellowed, drawn on what looked like the back of a surveyor's document. He unfolded it and spread it on the floor, and the lantern light revealed a detailed, meticulous diagram of the building. Not the architectural plans, not the engineering drawings, but something older, something that had been drawn by hand and annotated in Japanese characters that Daniel could not read. "I drew this when the building was being constructed," Goro said. "I watched them build it. I watched them lay the wiring and the conduit and the grounding rods. I know where the metal is and where it is not. The fire-rated corridors are clean. They are concrete and fire brick, no metal, no wiring. They form a network that connects the cellar to the east wing, the west wing, and the central atrium. You can move through the building staying in these corridors, and the Raiju will not feel you." "And the foam tanks?" Daniel asked. "Here," Goro pointed to a spot on the map. "Ground floor, east wing, service corridor E7. The tanks are mounted on the wall behind a mechanical panel. The release valves are at the top of each tank, red handles, quarter turn. Turn all four, and the foam floods the entire east wing corridor system. There is also a manual pull station at the corridor entrance that will activate the system for the central atrium." "And the atrium system?" Daniel asked. "If you activate both, the foam floods the east wing and the atrium. That gives you a path from the east wing to the atrium and from the atrium to the main exit. But the atrium is glass, Daniel, glass and steel. The creature will be there. The atrium is the heart of the building's electrical system. All the main conduits converge there. So I flood the atrium with foam, coat myself, and walk through it to the exit." "You flood the atrium, coat yourself, and walk through it to the exit," Goro repeated. "And you do not touch anything metal, not the door handles, not the railings, not the fixtures. The foam will insulate your skin, but if you touch a conductive surface, the creature will find you. It will follow the metal to your hand, and your hand to your body, and your body to your spark." Daniel looked at the map. He traced the route with his finger. The cellar stairs, the north wing fire corridor, the junction with the east wing service corridor, corridor E7, the foam tanks, the manual pull station, the atrium, the main exit. It was perhaps 300 meters of corridor, in the dark, in a building that was alive with the current of a thunder god's pet, and the margin for error was zero. "What about the rest of us?" Yuki asked. "Stay here," Goro said. "Stay in the cellar. Do not touch the door. Do not touch the walls. Sit. Wait. If Daniel succeeds, the foam will insulate the corridors, but it will not reach the cellar. You will need to wait until the storm breaks, until the Raiju disperses. Then you can leave." "How long?" James asked. "Hours," Goro said. "Maybe until dawn. The creature will feed until it is fully charged, and then it will seek the sky. When it leaves, the building will be dead," Daniel said. "Everything electronic will be dead." "Everything electronic is already dead," Goro said. "The building is the creature's body now. When the creature leaves, the body dies. Daniel looked at the map one more time. He memorized the route. He memorized the turns, the distances, the landmarks. Goro had annotated the map with small, precise notes. Junction, turn left. Stairwell, 12 steps. Low ceiling, duck. Foam tanks, right wall. He folded the map and put it in his pocket, and then he took off his watch. It was a stainless steel Omega, a gift from his father, and he set it on the concrete floor and looked at it for a moment. The crystal face was dark, the hands frozen. Dead. Everything metal was a beacon. He took off his belt. The buckle was steel. He took off his shoes. The eyelets were metal. He would go in his socks, his bare hands, his shirt and trousers, nothing else. "I need to go," he said. Mika looked up from Takeshi's shoulder. Her face was tear-streaked, her eyes red, but when she spoke, her voice was clear. "Please come back." Daniel did not answer. He could not, because the truth was that he did not know if he would come back, and the animal part of his brain, the part that had noticed the vibrating hairs and the taste of ozone, was screaming at him to sit down in the cellar and wait, to hide in the concrete and the dark and hope that the thing above him would leave on its own. But another part of his brain, a part that was older and louder, was calculating. 27 people, maybe fewer, maybe already gone, and the foam and the root and the odds were not good. But they were not zero, and in a building that had become a living circuit board, not zero was the best he was going to get. He went to the door and put his hand on the wheel lock. The metal was cold, not vibrating, not humming, clean. The cellar was a concrete box inside a steel-in glass shell, and the shell was occupied, but the box was still a box, still separate, still safe. For now. "Wait," Goro said. He stood and crossed the cellar and placed his hand on Daniel's shoulder. The old man's hand was rough and dry and strong, the hand of a man who had spent 30 years on a mountain, and when he spoke, his voice was low and direct. "The creature will show you things," Goro said. "In the corridors, in the dark, in the flickering. It will show you images, patterns. It will try to make you afraid because fear is an electrical event. Your nerves fire, your synapses discharge, your body becomes a lightning rod for its own terror. The more afraid you are, the more visible you are to it. Do you understand? Your fear is a beacon. You must not be afraid." "How do I not be afraid?" Daniel asked. "I'm terrified." Goro almost smiled. It was a thin, mirthless expression, the ghost of a smile worn by a man who had lived too long in the company of fear to waste energy on it. "Be terrified," he said, "but do not let it reach your nerves. Hold it here." He pressed his hand against Daniel's chest, against his sternum, against the bone that protected his heart. "Hold it here in the center where it is heavy and still and does not spark. The Raiju reads the sparks. Do not spark." Daniel nodded. He did not believe he could do it, but he nodded because that was what you did when an old man who had spent 30 years watching for a thunder beast told you to be still. He turned the wheel lock. The door opened. The stairwell beyond was dark and silent and cold. The concrete walls were bare, no wiring, no conduit, no metal. He stepped through the door and into the dark, and the door closed behind him, and he was alone. The fire-rated corridors were a different world. Daniel moved through them in the dark, one hand on the wall, his socked feet silent on the concrete. The walls were raw, unpainted fire brick and poured concrete, and they were cool and rough to the touch, and there was no vibration, no hum, no taste of ozone. The air was still and clean and smelled of nothing, just the mineral breath of concrete and the faint, distant scent of the mountain that seeped through the hairline cracks in the walls. He could have been in a tunnel, a bunker, a mine. He could have been underground. He moved by touch. The corridor turned left. He felt the corner with his hand, turned, continued. The ceiling dropped, he ducked, felt the concrete graze his hair, kept moving. A junction, he felt the floor change texture under his feet, from smooth concrete to the rougher surface of fire brick, and he knew from the map that this was the northeast junction, and that the east wing service corridor was straight ahead. He was moving well. He was calm. The fear was there, a heavy, cold mass in the center of his chest, exactly where Goro had told him to hold it, and it was still and it did not spark. He could feel his pulse, steady, strong, controlled, and he could feel his breathing, slow, deep, measured, and he was doing what Goro had told him to do, being terrified without being electric. And then the corridor ended. Not at a door, not at a wall, at a threshold. Daniel felt it with his foot, the transition from concrete to tile, the boundary between the fire-rated corridor and the regular building. The tile was cold and smooth, and it was humming. The vibration was faint, barely perceptible, but it was there, and Daniel knew that on the other side of this threshold, the wiring began. The conduit, the metal, the Raiju. He stood at the threshold and consulted his memory of the map. Corridor E7 was 20 meters ahead, through the tile-floored section on the right wall. 20 meters, 65 feet. In the dark, in a building that was alive with current, with nothing on his feet and nothing in his hands and nothing between him and the thing in the walls but a thin layer of cotton and the discipline of not sparking. He stepped onto the tile. The vibration climbed through the soles of his socks and into his feet and up his legs and into his spine, and it was not the deep, slow pulse he had felt in the atrium. It was fast, irregular, searching. It was the vibration of something moving, something hunting, something that was running its current through every wire and every conduit in the building, the way a spider runs its threads through a web, feeling for the vibration of a trapped fly. Daniel moved forward. He kept his hands at his sides. He did not touch the walls. He stepped carefully, placing each foot flat and silent, distributing his weight evenly, the way you walk on ice. The corridor was dark, truly dark, with no emergency lights, no flickering red strips, nothing, and the only sound was his own breathing, which he held to a whisper. 10 meters, the tile hummed. The air was thick with ozone. He could taste it, coppery and sharp, and the hairs on his arms were standing again, vibrating, and he could feel the static building against his skin like a pressure, like the air before a detonation. He clamped down on the fear. He held it in his chest, heavy and still. Do not spark. Do not spark. Do not spark. 15 meters. He passed a door on the left, a maintenance closet steel door, and through the steel he could hear the hum louder, a deep, resonant drone that made the door vibrate in its frame, and he pressed himself against the opposite wall, not touching it, just leaning close to the empty air beside it, and sidestepped past. The door was warm. He could feel the heat radiating from it, and he knew that behind it in the maintenance closet, the wiring was glowing. The wiring was alive. 18 meters. He could feel the foam tanks. Not see them, feel them. They were large, cold, metallic cylinders, and metal was a beacon, and the air around them was charged with a faint, crackling anticipation, as though the Raiju knew they were there and was curious about them, tasting them with its current, probing them with invisible fingers. Daniel could feel the hair on his scalp lifting, pulling toward the tanks, and he gritted his teeth and moved forward. 20 meters. His hand found the wall and he followed it, his fingers hovering a centimeter above the surface, reading the texture, tile, tile, grout line, tile, and then the rough, industrial surface of a mechanical panel. He had reached the foam tanks. The panel was locked, not with a key, with a latch, a metal latch. Daniel's hand hovered over it. He could feel the charge in the metal, a faint, tingling invitation like the pull of a magnet. He took a breath. He held the fear still. He pinched the latch between his thumb and forefinger, gripping only the plastic coating, avoiding the bare metal, and he pulled. The panel opened. The foam tanks were inside, 4 large pressurized cylinders, each one the size of a man, mounted to the wall with steel brackets. They were cold to the touch, condensation beading on their green surfaces, and at the top of each tank was a red handle, exactly as Goro had described. The release valves, quarter turn. But the handles were metal, bare, red-painted metal. And the air around them was alive with charge, the Raiju's current running through the wall behind the tanks, through the brackets, through the tanks themselves. And when Daniel moved his hand toward the first handle, he felt the static surge. The hairs on his arm stood straight up. and a thin, blue spark arced from the handle to his fingertip, and the spark was not painful but it was informative. It told him that the Raiju was close, that the current was here, that the handle was a conductor, and touching it would be like touching the creature's tongue. He pulled his hand back. He stood in the dark in the narrow mechanical alcove, with 4 foam tanks in front of him and a thunder beast in the walls, and he thought. He thought the way he thought in boardrooms, clearly, logically, stepping through the problem one variable at a time. The handles were metal. He could not touch them, but the foam itself, the fluoroprotein foam inside the tanks, was non-conductive. If he could open the valves without touching the metal, the foam would flood the corridor, and the corridor would become insulated, and the Raiju would lose its sense in this section of the building. He looked at his socks. Cotton, thin, not enough insulation. He looked at his shirt. Cotton. He pulled the shirt off and wrapped it around his right hand, thick, multiple layers, and he gripped the first handle through the fabric. The current bit. Not hard. A faint, tingling pressure that traveled through the cotton and into his palm, and his arm hairs surged, and the fear in his chest spiked, and he felt the spark. The animal spark. The electrical surge of terror that Goro had warned him about, and he crushed it. He crushed it the way you crush a coal in your fist, holding it tight, compressing it, not letting it expand, not letting it reach his nerves, not letting it become a beacon. He turned the handle, quarter turn. The valve opened with a hiss and the foam erupted. It came out of the tank in a thick, white, suffocating torrent. Not a spray, but a flood. A viscous, expanding mass that poured from the valve and down the side of the tank, and onto the floor and across the corridor, spreading, bubbling, growing, filling the space with a cold, chemical blanket that smelled of detergent and synthetic rubber. Daniel gripped the second handle and turned it, and the third and the fourth, and each time the current bit through the cotton, and each time he crushed the fear, and the foam poured and spread and the corridor filled, and the hum in the walls changed. It faltered. The vibration stuttered like a heartbeat skipping a beat, and Daniel felt the charge in the air weaken, not disappear but diminish, as though the foam were a blanket thrown over a fire, smothering it, cutting off its oxygen. The Raiju was losing its grip on this section of the building. The non-conductive foam was breaking the circuit and the creature's current could not pass through it, and for the first time since the dead light bulb, Daniel felt the air taste like nothing. Like clean, cold, empty air. He was soaked. The foam covered his feet, his legs, his chest, his arms, his face. It was cold and thick and clung to his skin like a second layer, and he understood. This was the insulation. This was the cloak. Goro had told him to coat himself, and the foam had done it for him, coating every surface of his body in a non-conductive shell that made him, to the Raiju's electrical perception, invisible. He waded through the foam-filled corridor back toward the atrium. The manual pull station was at the corridor entrance. Goro had marked it on the map, and Daniel found it by touch, a small, red, mechanical device mounted on the wall, with a pull lever that he could operate with his sure-trapped hand. He pulled it. Nothing happened for 3 seconds. Then the building groaned, a deep, structural sound, like the sound of a ship's hull flexing in a heavy sea, and the foam system in the atrium activated. He could not see it, but he could hear it. The hiss of pressurized nitrogen releasing, the splatter and gurgle of foam erupting from ceiling-mounted nozzles, the thick, spreading silence of insulation blanketing a space that had been alive with current. He moved toward the atrium. The foam was everywhere now, ankle-deep in the corridors, knee-deep in the junctions, rising and spreading like a tide of white silence. The hum was gone from the walls. The vibration was gone from the floor. The taste of ozone was gone from the air. The foam had created a dead zone, a pocket of insulation in the body of the building, and in that pocket Daniel was a ghost. He reached the atrium. The foam was waist-deep here. The atrium's fire suppression system was more powerful, with larger tanks and more nozzles, and the foam had filled the vast space like a swimming pool, and Daniel waded through it, his sure-trapped hands held above the surface, his body coated, invisible, a man swimming through a sea of insulation in a building that had become a beast. The sculpture was gone. The aluminum monstrosity that had been glowing with the Raiju's light had been swallowed by the foam, and the blue-white glow was gone, extinguished, and in its place was only the white, bubbling silence of the foam. The glass walls of the atrium were still there, still covered in their Lichtenberg figures, but the figures were dimming, fading, as though the creature's current was withdrawing from this section of the building, pulling back like a tide receding from a shore. And then Daniel heard it, not in the walls, not in the wiring, in the air. A sound that he felt in his bones, in his teeth, in the marrow of his spine. A crack, a thunderclap, inside the building, inside the room. Not outside, not in the sky, but here in the atrium, 10 feet to his left, and the shockwave of sound hit him like a physical blow, and he staggered and nearly went under the foam, and his ears burst. Not popped, burst. The pressure was so immense, so concentrated, that both his eardrums ruptured simultaneously, and the world went silent. Not the muffled silence of a head cold, but the absolute, annihilating silence of total hearing loss, and Daniel was deaf. He was deaf and he was blind. The foam and the shockwave had filled his eyes with chemical sting and tears, and he was standing waist-deep in a sea of insulation in a building that was occupied by a creature made of lightning. And the only thing keeping him alive was the foam on his skin and the fear in his chest and the discipline of not sparking. He could not hear the creature. He could not see the creature. He could only feel it, and what he felt, through the foam, through the silence, was the displacement of air. A pressure wave. Something large moving through the space above the foam, something that crackled and snapped and threw heat, something that was searching for him with a current that could not find his body because his body was wrapped in a non-conductive shell. He moved forward. He did not know which direction was the exit. The foam had erased all landmarks, all visual reference, and he was deaf and nearly blind and wading through a white sea. But his hand found a wall, glass, cold, covered in foam, and he followed it, sliding his fingers along the surface, and the glass led to a frame, and the frame led to a door. The door was metal. He could feel the charge in it, the Raiju's current, still flowing through the building's skeleton, still alive in the steel. But the foam was on his hand, thick and insulating, and he pushed the door. It did not move. It was locked, not by a lock, by something else. Daniel pushed again, harder, and the door shifted an inch, and through the gap he felt air, cold, clean mountain air, the air of the outside, the air of the real world, and he pushed with everything he had, his shoulder against the metal, his socked feet slipping on the foam-slicked floor, and the door opened another inch, and he squeezed through the gap and fell. He fell out of the building and onto the stone plateau, and the mountain air hit him like a wall, cold, thin, razor-sharp, the air of the Japanese Alps at 2,000 meters, and he gasped and choked and rolled onto his back and looked up at the sky. The sky was no longer blue. The clouds had come, not gradually, not building over the horizon the way storms build, but all at once, as though the sky had been painted with ink while no one was looking. The clouds were black and bruised and low, and they were rotating, a slow, ponderous spiral that centered directly above the building. And inside the spiral, Daniel could see the lightning, not striking down but crawling upward, climbing from the building's lightning rods into the sky in branching, blue-white threads that converged and merged and grew, as though the building were feeding the storm, as though the Raiju were returning its charge to the atmosphere from which it came. The storm broke. The rain came not as water but as light. Daniel lay on his back on the stone plateau, his body coated in foam, his ears ringing with the high, empty whine of ruptured eardrums, and the storm above him did not rain, it discharged. The clouds opened in sheets of blue-white fire, and the lightning did not strike the ground but filled the air, a continuous, branching, three-dimensional web of electrical discharge that connected the sky to the building in 1,000 simultaneous paths, and each path was a vein, and each vein was carrying the Raiju's energy upward, away from the building, back into the atmosphere where it belonged. The building was bleeding lightning. It poured from the lightning rods in thick, steady streams, and from the exposed steel beams, and from the shattered glass walls where the foam had pushed through and the charge followed, and the building shook, not with the deep, structural tremor of an earthquake but with a high, singing vibration, the sound of metal resonating at a frequency that Daniel could not hear but could feel in his teeth and his spine and the roots of his hair. The building was resonating. The building was singing its own death song. Daniel crawled. He crawled away from the building on his hands and knees, his socked feet tearing on the rough stone, his foam-coated body leaving a trail of white froth on the black rock, and he did not look back. He could not look back. Because looking back would mean seeing the thing that was rising from the building, and the animal part of his brain, the part that had kept him alive through the corridors and the foam and the dark, told him with absolute, primal certainty that if he looked back, he would not be able to hold the fear in his chest. It would spark, it would ignite, and the creature would feel it, and the creature would turn, and the creature would reach for him with a current that could follow the moisture on his skin, and the salt in his tears, and the iron in his blood, and the spark in his heart, and it would take him. So he crawled. He crawled until his hands were raw and his knees were bleeding, and the foam on his body had dried to a stiff, white crust, and then he crawled some more, across the plateau, past the scrub pine, toward the cliff edge where the plateau fell away into the river gorge, and the world dropped 600 meters into the green, cold, electrically innocent dark of the valley below. He reached the cliff edge and collapsed. He lay on his stomach with his head over the edge, and the valley was below him, dark and deep and silent, and the river was a thin, silver thread far below, and the air that rose from the valley was cold and clean and smelled of pine sap and wet rock and the mineral breath of the mountain, and there was no ozone. There was no copper, there was no hum. There was only the mountain and the night and the storm behind him, and Daniel pressed his face against the cold stone and wept. He wept because his ears were ringing, and he could not hear himself weep. He wept because his hands were torn and his feet were bleeding, and his body was shaking with a tremor that he could not control, the muscles twitching and jerking in tiny, involuntary spasms, the aftermath of the current that had passed through him when he touched the valve handles, the echo of the Raiju's charge still resonating in his nervous system like a bell that had been struck and was still ringing. He wept because 27 people, maybe fewer now, maybe none, were still inside the building, and he had done what Goro had told him to do, and he had survived, and he did not know if anyone else had. He lay there for a long time, hours. The storm raged behind him, the lightning climbing the sky in its terrible, beautiful, branching streams, and the building shook and sang and bled its charge into the atmosphere, and Daniel watched the valley below and the stars above the storm, hard, white, indifferent points of light in the thin mountain air, and he waited for the storm to break. During those hours, he thought about his life, not in the grand, narrative way that men think about their lives when they are dying, the reel of memories, the highlights, the regrets, but in the small, granular way that men think when they are surviving, when the body is broken and the mind is still running, still calculating, still processing the data of existence because that is all it knows how to do. He thought about the apartment in Tokyo, the one with the dead light bulb that he had not yet replaced because he had been too busy, because there was always something more urgent than a dead light bulb. He thought about the presentation he had been waiting for, the strategic plan, the market analysis, the quarterly projections, and how absurd it seemed now, how obscenely, grotesquely trivial, the idea of a PowerPoint slide in a conference room on the 14th floor of a building that had been swallowed by a creature made of lightning. He thought about Taniguchi, the old man in the corner office, and his words. The mountains have a way of clarifying things, but they also have a way of revealing what is hidden. Daniel understood now what had been hidden. What had been hidden was the truth that the world was not a building, not a balance sheet, not a strategy. The world was a thin crust of stone over a depth of fire, and the sky was a thin shell of air over a depth of charge, and the creatures that lived in those depths did not care about quarterly earnings or market share or the elegant geometry of Danish architects. They cared about the spark, the icky, the breath of life that animated every trembling, terrified, hair-standing, ozone-tasting, desperately surviving human being on the surface of this fragile, beautiful, terrifying earth. He thought about his mother. She was 73 and lived alone in a small house in Portland, and she did not know where he was, did not know what had happened, would not know until someone told her, and the telling would be, what? A phone call from a consulate, a news report, a corporate press release drafted by lawyers and scrubbed of anything that might imply liability. He thought about calling her, but his phone was dead, and there was no signal on the mountain, and even if there were, what would he say? Mother, I was in a building that was eaten by a lightning wolf, and 23 of my colleagues are sealed in glass, and my hair is turning white, and I can still feel the current in my bones. No. He would not call her. He would call her when he was home, when he was clean, when the foam was off his body, and the blood was washed from his hands, and the shaking had stopped, when he could lie convincingly enough to spare her the truth, or at least the shape of it, the outline of the horror without the details that would make her unable to sleep for the rest of her life. He thought about the dead, 23 people. He knew their names. He had prepared the seating chart for the retreat, had assigned the rooms, had printed the name badges. He could see their faces in the dark. Haruto Sato, the VP of engineering who had a crooked smile and a collection of vintage fountain pens. Liang Wei, the CFO of the Chinese subsidiary, who was terrified of heights and had asked for a ground floor room. Maria Castellano, the head of European marketing, who had 2 children and a husband who taught high school history. 23 faces, 23 sparks, now sealed in glass, their icky consumed by a creature that had no use for names or faces or fountain pen collections or children or husbands or the terror of heights. The Raiju had taken them the way a river takes stones, not out of malice but out of nature, because that was what it did, because it was a force, and forces do not choose, they simply flow. The storm broke at dawn. Daniel did not see it begin. He had drifted into a state that was not sleep but was not consciousness, a gray, buzzing limbo where his body rested but his nerves still hummed, still vibrated with the phantom current of the Raiju's passage. He woke, or surfaced, or emerged, when the quality of the air changed. It was subtle. The temperature dropped, the wind shifted, and the oppressive metallic heaviness that had pressed against the mountain all night simply vanished, like a hand lifting from a drum. The air became light, clean, thin, the air of the Japanese Alps at dawn in autumn, cold and clear and sharp as a blade. Daniel turned over. The sky was pale. The clouds were gone, not retreating, not dissolving, but gone as though they had been erased. The sky was the color of ash, a flat, featureless gray that was not yet blue but was no longer black. And in the east, behind the mountains, there was a thin line of gold that was the sun, still below the horizon, still rising, and the light of it touched the peaks and turned them from black to gray to white to gold in a slow, deliberate wave that rolled across the Alps like a hand smoothing a wrinkled sheet. The building was still standing. Daniel had expected it to be gone, vaporized, collapsed, disintegrated, but it was there on the plateau exactly where it had always been, a stark geometric silhouette against the paling sky. But it was changed. The glass walls were gone, not shattered, not broken, but absent, as though the glass had been dissolved or absorbed or pulled back into the earth. The steel frame was scorched, blackened, warped in places where the heat had been greatest, and the concrete core was cracked and split, with long, jagged fissures running up its faces like the lines on a weathered face. The building looked like a skeleton, the bones of a structure that had once been alive and was now dead, picked clean by a predator that had no use for what remained. And at the base of the building, where the main entrance had been, there was a circle, a perfect circle, perhaps 10 meters in diameter, where the stone of the plateau had been transformed. Daniel got to his feet, His legs screamed, his feet burned, his hands throbbed, and he limped toward the circle, and as he got closer he saw what it was. The stone had been vitrified. The rough, gray mountain rock had been fused into glass, smooth, black, translucent like obsidian, and within the glass, Daniel could see the shadows of what had been. Shadows of the foam, frozen in mid-bubble. Shadows of the carpet, its fibers immortalized in the glass like insects in amber. And deeper, darker shadows, shapes that might have been furniture or walls or people, but they were too distorted, too fused, too absorbed into the glass to be identifiable. The Raiju had not just left. It had discharged its remaining energy into the earth in a final, cataclysmic release, and the heat had been so intense that it had fused the stone to glass and sealed everything within it in a transparent tomb. Daniel stood at the edge of the vitrified circle and looked at the building. The building was dead. Every electronic surface was dark. Every light was off. Every wire was cold. The building had been the Raiju's body, and the Raiju had left, and the body was a husk, a scorched, cracked, glass-edged husk that would never house another charge. He turned away from the building and limped toward the cellar entrance. The heavy steel door was still closed, the wheel lock still engaged. He reached for it and stopped. The metal was cold. No hum, no vibration, no charge. He gripped the wheel and spun it, and the door opened, and the stairwell beyond was dark and still and smelled of concrete and the faint, chemical scent of foam. "Yuki," he called. His voice sounded strange, thin, distant, muffled by the foam and the damage to his ears, as though he were speaking through a wall. "James, anyone." Silence, then footsteps, rapid, urgent, climbing the stairs. Yuki appeared at the top, her face pale, her eyes wide, her hair loose and disheveled. She looked at Daniel, at his foam-crusted body, his torn socks, his bleeding hands, his face, and she said nothing. She simply stepped forward and put her arms around him and held on, and Daniel could feel her shaking, and he could feel his own shaking, and they stood there in the stairwell, two executives in a ruined building, holding each other up. Behind Yuki, the others emerged. James, still clutching the carving knife, his face set and hard. Kobayashi, expressionless as ever, but his eyes were red. The catering staff, Mika and Takeshi and the others, young and frightened and alive. The cleaning crew. And Goro last, the old groundskeeper, who climbed the stairs slowly and emerged into the dawn light and looked at the vitrified circle and the scorched building and the clear, empty sky, and whose face, for the first time since Daniel had met him, showed something other than patience. It showed relief. "It's gone," Goro said. Not a question. A statement. The kind of statement a man makes when he has been holding his breath for 30 years and can finally let it out. "What about the others?" James asked. "The rest of the staff, the leadership team?" Goro did not answer. He walked toward the vitrified circle, and he stopped at its edge, and he looked down into the glass, and his face was old and still and sad. "They are in the glass," he said. No one spoke. Mika turned away and pressed her face into Takeshi's chest, and her shoulders shook, and Takeshi held her and looked at the ground. James closed his eyes. Yuki's hand tightened on Daniel's arm. And Daniel looked at the vitrified circle, at the shadows frozen within it, the shapes that had been people, that had been his colleagues, that had been men and women with families and plans and mortgages and ambitions, all of it reduced to dark, distorted silhouettes sealed in a circle of glass on a mountain plateau in the Japanese Alps. And he felt the fear in his chest, the fear that he had held all night, the fear that he had crushed and compressed and kept from sparking, and it broke. It broke not as a spark but as a wave. A slow, heavy, crushing wave of grief and exhaustion, and the animal, visceral knowledge that he had walked through the body of a god's pet and had survived, and that survival was not the same as victory, and that the dead were in the glass, and the glass would be there long after he was gone. They found the survivors, not in the building, in the woods. During the night, while Daniel had been crawling through the foam and the storm had been raging, 3 more people had escaped the building, not through the corridors, not through Goro's route, but through the kitchen. The head chef, a stocky, unflappable woman named Haruko, had been in the walk-in freezer when the power failed, and the freezer was, by design, a sealed, insulated, metal-lined box with no windows and a heavy, mechanical door. She had been safe, trapped but safe, and when the building's hum had stopped and the air had changed, she had opened the freezer door, gathered two of her kitchen staff who had been hiding in the pantry, and they had climbed out through the kitchen's delivery entrance, a steel roll-up door that she had managed to open manually, and they had run into the woods and hidden in a drainage ditch until dawn. They were shaken, cold, and in shock, but they were alive. Haruko had a burn on her left hand where she had touched the roll-up door's handle before the foam had insulated it, and the burn was shaped like a Lichtenberg figure, a branching, forked pattern of reddened skin that traced the path of the current through her flesh. She would carry that scar for the rest of her life. The final count, 12 survivors from the cellar, plus Daniel, plus Haruko and her two staff. 16 people alive, 23 dead, their remains sealed in the vitrified glass at the base of the building, indistinguishable from the stone and the metal and the foam that had been fused with them. Daniel sat on a rock at the edge of the plateau and watched the sun rise fully over the Alps. The light was gold and warm and clean, and it fell on the vitrified circle and made it glow, not with the blue-white fire of the Raiju but with the ordinary, beautiful, electrically inert light of a mountain morning. The glass sparkled. It was, Daniel thought, the most terrible, beautiful thing he had ever seen. Yuki sat beside him. Her hair, which had been black and smooth and perfectly maintained, was streaked with white. Not gray-white. Stark, snow-white strands that ran through the black like lightning through a dark sky. She touched one of them, pulled it forward, looked at it, and let it fall. "It's the shock," she said. "My grandmother told me. The people who survive the Raiju, the ones who are close to it, who feel its current, their hair turns white. It is the mark, the proof that you were touched by the thunder beast and lived." Daniel looked at his own hands. They were shaking. The tremor was still there, the phantom current still resonating in his nerves, and he wondered if it would ever stop. He wondered if his body would always hum with the memory of the Raiju's passage, if his nerves would always carry that faint, invisible charge, if the taste of ozone would ever leave his tongue. He looked at the mountains. The Alps were calm, indifferent, vast, their white peaks sharp against the blue sky that was returning now, the clear, depthless blue that had fooled him into thinking the world was safe. The mountains did not care about the Raiju or the building or the 23 dead. The mountains had been here before the creature, and they would be here after, and they would absorb the glass circle into their geology and forget it, the way they forgot everything. But Daniel would not forget. He would carry the vitrified circle and the hum in his nerves and the white that was already spreading through his own dark hair for the rest of his life. He would carry the taste of pennies and ozone and the weight of the silence before the storm. And he would carry the sound, or rather, the absence of sound, that he heard every time a distant thunder rolled over the mountains. The ghost of a crack, a thunderclap that happened inside a room, a sound that had burst his eardrums and left him deaf in the presence of a creature made of lightning, a sound that he could not hear but that his bones remembered, that his spine remembered, that the roots of his white-streaked hair remembered with a vibration that would never, ever stop. The sun rose, the glass glowed, the mountain was still. And somewhere in the clouds that were rebuilding over the far horizon, in the charge that was accumulating in the cold, high air, in the space between the sky and the earth where the lightning lived, something stirred. Not awake, not hunting, just stirring, turning over in its sleep, dreaming of the next storm, dreaming of the next building, dreaming of the next time the wires would hum and the air would taste of copper and the hairs on a man's arms would stand straight up and vibrate in the silence before the strike. The Raiju was gone, but the Raiju was always gone, and the Raiju always came back. 3 months later, Daniel Cho sat in his apartment in Tokyo in the blue dark of a winter evening and stared at the dead light bulb in his kitchen ceiling. It had died an hour ago. He had not replaced it. He was sitting in the dark, and the hairs on his arms were standing straight up, and the air tasted like pennies. He was not afraid, he was past fear. He was in the territory beyond fear, the cold, clean, empty territory of a man who has already been touched by the worst thing the sky can produce, and who knows that the worst thing the sky can produce is not a bolt of lightning or a crash of thunder but the silence before it, the heavy, pressurized, metallic silence that descends on the world when all the ambient sound has been sucked upward into the building charge, and the air is full of potential, and the hairs on your arms are vibrating, and you know, with a sudden, cold clarity that has nothing to do with reason and everything to do with the animal part of your brain that has kept your species alive for 1,000,000 years, that the storm is not coming. The storm is already here. Daniel picked up his phone. It was working. He had replaced the old one, the one that had died in the conference room on the 14th floor of a building that no longer existed. He dialed a number. It rang once, twice, 3 times. "Yuki," he said, "it's happening again." Silence on the line. Then Yuki's voice, steady, calm, the voice of a woman who had read the quarterly report of the end of the world and had not flinched. "Where?" "Not the mountains," Daniel said. "Not this time, the city, the grid. It's in the grid, Yuki. I can feel it in the walls." Another silence, longer this time. He could hear Yuki breathing and in the background the faint, distant sound of the wind in the wires, the hum, the terrible, beautiful, searching hum of a current that was looking for a body to fill. "I'll call Goro," Yuki said. "Call him now," Daniel said. "Call him now because the lights just flickered and I can hear it moving and it's close and I can feel it, Yuki. I can feel it in my teeth and, Yuki." The lights went out. The line went dead. And in the dark of his apartment, in the silence that was not silence but the displacement of sound, Daniel Cho felt the hairs on his arms stand straight up and vibrate, and the air tasted like pennies and ozone, and the storm that was not a storm but a creature, the storm that was not a creature but a force, the storm that had no body and every body, that lived in the wires and the walls and the space between the sky and the earth, began to hum. It was in the building. It was the building. And this time there was no cellar. Author's note on the Raiju. The Raiju Chinese letter, thunder beast, is a creature from Japanese mythology described as the companion of Raijin, the Shinto god of lightning, thunder, and storms. In folklore, the Raiju takes various forms, a wolf, a cat, a weasel, a monkey, or a ball of lightning, and descends from the sky during thunderstorms. It is said to sleep in navels during storms, which is why it was traditionally considered wise to sleep on your stomach during thunderstorms. The creature's behavior in this story, the ability to travel through electrical systems, to feed on the life force of living beings, to manifest as a ball of lightning, and to take the form of a blue-white wolf, is drawn from these traditional accounts, extrapolated into a modern setting where the wires and walls of a high-tech building serve as the creature's nervous system. The concept of the Lichtenberg figure, the branching pattern left by an electrical discharge on a dielectric surface, is a real phenomenon, and the vitrification of Earth by lightning strikes, which creates a substance called fulgurite or petrified lightning, is also real. The foam-based fire suppression system described in the story is based on actual fluoroprotein foam systems used in industrial and aviation fire protection, which are indeed non-conductive and work by smothering electrical fires. Everything else, the silence before the storm, the taste of ozone, the hairs standing on end, the terrible, beautiful, searching hum of a current looking for a body to fill, is also real. It is the sound of the world before lightning. It is the sound of something very old looking for a way in. The Cistern's Tithe. Chapter 1. The needle was rusted. That was the thing he noticed first, not the pain, not the blood, not the way the heavy brown burlap refused to lie flat against his skin, but the rust on the needle. Orange-brown, flaking, leaving tiny particulate streaks along the thread as he drew it through his own flesh. The pain was extraordinary, a white-hot lightning that ran from the wound in his forearm up to his shoulder and down into his ribs, but he had stopped feeling pain hours ago, or perhaps it was days ago, or perhaps it had only been minutes. Time had become unreliable in the palazzo. The walls breathed, the floors shifted, the ceiling sometimes lowered itself by inches while he slept, and the distance between the plaster and his nose would be measurably, terrifyingly smaller when he woke. He was humming. The tune was something his grandmother had sung to him, a nursery rhyme in Neapolitan dialect, something about a little monk who came down the chimney and stole the bread from the windowsill. "O Monaciello," the little monk. He hummed it through clenched teeth as the needle punctured his skin again, and the thread drew tight, pulling the burlap another centimeter closer to being part of him. He believed, with the totality of a man who has been hunted through the labyrinth of his own home for what feels like eternity, that if he could only become part of the robe, if he could sew the fabric into his skin, make himself indistinguishable from the cloth, then the little monk would stop looking for him, would not recognize him as a person, would pass him by the way one passes a discarded coat in a hallway. His fingers were slick with his own blood and the needle kept slipping. He gripped it harder, driving it through the edge of the burlap and then through the meat of his left forearm, and he pulled and the thread tightened, and the burlap folded against his skin with a wet, intimate sound like a bandage finding a wound. He gasped but did not stop humming. O Monaciello, vien dalla canna del camino. Then he heard it. A wet slapping sound, from below, from the floorboards. It was not the sound of footsteps. Footsteps had a rhythm, a predictability, a human logic to them. This was something else. It was the sound of something damp being dragged across wood, or perhaps the sound of something wet being pressed against a surface, and then released over and over like a tongue against a plate, like a palm against wet stone. It came from directly beneath him, from the space between the floorboards and the cistern below, and it had a pattern to it: slap, pause, slap, pause, slap, pause, slap. As if something down there were counting, or waiting, or both. The man stopped humming. His mouth stayed open, the last note of the nursery rhyme dying on his lips like a candle flame guttering in a draught. He looked down at the floorboards. They were old, centuries old, the wood darkened with age and wax, and between the boards there were gaps, thin, black lines where the wood had shrunk and warped. And through those gaps, if you looked carefully, if you pressed your face to the floor and stared, you could see the darkness below. The cistern. The old water cistern that had been sealed since his grandfather's time, that had been bricked over and forgotten, that should have been empty and dry and dead. But the sound was wet, and it was getting closer. The man pressed the burlap harder against his arm, driving the needle in faster now, no longer trying to be precise, just trying to finish, trying to become cloth, trying to stop being a thing that could be found. The slapping sound accelerated beneath him, matching his tempo as if whatever was below could hear him working, could sense his desperation, was amused by it, was entertained by the sight of a man trying to sew himself into a disguise. And then the floorboard beneath his left knee creaked, not with the weight of his body, which it had borne for the last hour without complaint, but with the weight of something else, something pressing up from below, something testing the wood from the underside. The creak was followed by a sound that was worse than the slapping, worse than the counting, worse than anything the man had heard in the long, terrible days since the house had changed. It was a click, a wet, deliberate click, like the sound of a tongue being pulled from the roof of a mouth, and then another, and another, a rapid, chittering sequence of clicks, the kind of sound that a creature might make to echolocate, to map the terrain above it, to find the exact position of the thing it was hunting. The man screamed. It was the first sound he had made that was not the nursery rhyme in hours, and it tore out of him like something alive, raw and animal and utterly without hope. He dropped the needle. The burlap, half sewn into his arm, hung loose and dark with blood. He scrambled backward on the floor, his hands and knees slipping on the old wood, and as he moved, the clicking beneath him moved with him, tracking him, following his trajectory across the room with the precision of a thing that could see through solid matter. He reached the wall. The wall was not where it should have been. He knew this room, or he had known it, once before the house began to change, and the wall should have been 4 meters from the fireplace, but now it was only 2, as if the room had compressed in the night, as if the walls had crept inward while he was not looking, and the distance between objects was not to be trusted. He pressed his back against the wall, and the plaster was damp, and it gave slightly under his weight, as if the wall itself were not solid but were merely a membrane stretched over something soft and wet. The clicking stopped. The silence was worse. In the silence, the man could hear his own heartbeat, could hear the wet sound of the burlap moving against his wound as his arm trembled, could hear the ancient timbers of the palazzo groaning softly, as if the building itself were in pain or in anticipation. He held his breath. The floorboards did not creak. The slapping did not resume. Nothing clicked. The room was still. Then, slowly, with the infinite patience of a thing that has waited in the dark for centuries, a single brown finger emerged from the gap between 2 floorboards. It was not a human finger. It was too long, too thin, and it was the color of old burlap, brown and rough and fibrous, as if the finger itself were made of cloth, or as if cloth had grown over it like a callus. It emerged an inch, then 2, then 3, and it did not bend. It simply extended, reaching upward through the gap in the wood, feeling the air above the floor, and it moved left, then right, in a slow, sweeping motion, like the antenna of an insect searching for the scent of prey. The man did not breathe. The finger swept an inch from his knee. He could smell it, a smell like wet clay and old bread, and something deeper, something mineral and ancient, the smell of the deep earth, of the tunnels that ran beneath Naples like the veins of a buried god. The finger paused. It had found something. Not the man, not yet, but the needle. The rusted needle, lying on the floor where he had dropped it, still threaded with the brown string, still spotted with his blood. The finger touched it. There was a sound, not a click, not a slap, but something else, something like a sigh, like the sound of recognition. And then the finger retreated, pulling the needle down through the gap in the floorboards with it, and the needle was gone, swallowed by the dark, and the man understood with a cold, lucid clarity that the thing beneath the floor had taken his needle the way a teacher confiscates a toy from a child who has been naughty. The message was clear: you cannot hide, you cannot sew yourself into safety. I have taken your needle. Now stop playing and come downstairs. The man began to cry. The tears ran down his face and mixed with the blood on his hands, and he slid down the wall until he was sitting on the floor, and the burlap hung from his arm like a torn flag, and somewhere beneath him, deep in the cistern, something wet began to laugh. It was not a human laugh. It was the sound of water slapping stone, of wet fabric being shaken, of a tongue clicking in the dark, and it rose through the floorboards and filled the room like a tide, and the man covered his ears and began to hum the nursery rhyme again, and this time he did not stop. Chapter 2. The palazzo. Moretti had been dying for decades before the spirit arrived. It stood on a narrow street in the heart of Naples, in the quartiere of the old city where the buildings pressed against each other like mourners at a funeral, their facades streaked with the patina of centuries, their balconies rusted and sagging, their shutters hanging at angles that spoke of a gradual, dignified surrender to time. The Moretti family had owned the palazzo for 5 generations, and for 5 generations it had been a monument to their name. Its frescoed ceilings, its marble staircases, its courtyard garden where lemon trees grew in terracotta pots, and the fountain, long dry, stood as a centerpiece of faded grandeur. But monuments, like the families that build them, are subject to entropy, and by the time Isabelle Moretti was old enough to understand the family's finances, the palazzo was not a monument but a ruin. Her father, Tommaso Moretti, was a man who had been born into wealth and had spent his life watching it evaporate. He was 53, but he looked older. His face was drawn and hollow. His eyes had the permanent squint of a man who has been staring at spreadsheets and legal documents for too long, and his hands, which had once been strong enough to lift Isabelle onto his shoulders when she was a child, now trembled when he held his coffee cup. He had inherited the palazzo, the debts, and the obligation to maintain both, and the obligation had eaten him from the inside like a slow disease. He sat in his study on the second floor, surrounded by piles of unpaid bills and legal notices, and he drank grappa in the morning and wine in the afternoon and sometimes, late at night, when the house was quiet and the only sound was the distant dripping of water from the old cistern in the basement, he wept. Not loudly, not with the abandon of a man who has given up, but quietly, desperately, with the controlled grief of a man who knows that the ship is sinking, and that he is the captain, and that there are still people on board. Isabelle was 23. She was the youngest of 3 children. The others, Marco and Sofia, had long since fled, Marco to a job in Milan, Sofia to a marriage in Rome, and she had stayed because someone had to. She had stayed because the palazzo was the only home she had ever known, because the frescoes on the ceiling of her bedroom had been painted by an ancestor in the 18th century, and she could not bear to see them sold to a hotel chain, because the lemon trees in the courtyard had been planted by her grandmother, and they still bore fruit, small and sour and yellow, and every autumn Isabelle picked them and made limoncello, and the taste of it was the taste of her childhood, and she would not let that go. She stayed, and she watched her father shrink, and she watched the palazzo crumble, and she tried to hold things together with the stubborn, irrational hope of a young woman who has not yet learned that some things cannot be saved by love alone. Her mother, Contessa Lucia Moretti, had died 3 years prior. Cancer. It had been quick and brutal, and in its aftermath the family had fractured further. Marco stopped calling, Sofia stopped visiting, and Tommaso retreated into his study like a monk into a cell. And the palazzo, which had always seemed to Isabelle like a living thing, began to die in earnest. The roof leaked. The plaster cracked. The shutters on the 3rd floor hung open and banged in the wind, and Isabelle would lie awake at night listening to the rhythmic slap of wood against stone and feel the house shuddering around her like an old man with a cough. It was in this state of decay, this atmosphere of slow ruin, that Isabelle found the diary. She had been in the attic, the vast, dusty, cobwebbed attic that ran the full length of the palazzo, its rafters exposed, its floor covered with decades of accumulated junk. Broken furniture, trunks of old clothes, crates of books that had not been opened since her great-grandmother's time. She was looking for a specific trunk, one that contained, she had been told, a set of silver candlesticks that might be worth something at a market, and she had pulled aside a stack of rotting canvas and a broken mirror, and a portrait of an ancestor whose face had been eaten by mildew, and behind the portrait, wedged between the wall and a cedar chest, she had found a small leather book. It was bound in dark brown leather, cracked and stiff with age, and it had a strap that buckled closed, and when she opened it, the pages were yellow and spotted with brown foxing, and the handwriting was small and precise and faded, and it was in Italian, but an old Italian, the Italian of another century, with words she sometimes had to puzzle over and phrases that felt archaic on her tongue. The diary belonged to one Gennaro Moretti, and the date on the first page was 1843. Isabelle sat on the floor of the attic, surrounded by the detritus of her family's decline, and she read. The early entries were mundane, accounts of the household, the weather, the price of grain, the birth of a child, the death of an uncle. But as she read further, the entries changed. They became more focused, more urgent, and they began to revolve around a single subject, the Monaciello. June 14, 1843. Today I set a plate of bread and a cup of wine by the cistern in the cellar. Nana says the Monaciello will come if he is invited, and that he brings gold to those who treat him well. I think this is superstition, but the family owes money to the butcher, and the butcher is impatient, and I am willing to try anything. June 16, 1843. The bread is gone, the wine is drunk. In its place 3 coins of old gold, heavier than any coin I have seen, stamped with a face I do not recognize. I do not know what to make of this. I left another plate tonight. June 20, 1843. More gold. Each morning the plate is empty and the coins sit in a small pile as if placed there by a careful hand. The gold is real. I have taken it to a jeweler in the Naples, and he says it is ancient, possibly Roman, and worth more than its weight. I asked him where such coins might come from, and he shrugged and said there are tunnels beneath the city older than the city itself, and who knows what lies in them. I did not tell him about the Monaciello. July 3, 1843. The gold continues, but the house is changing. Doors I have locked are found open in the morning. The furniture shifts not much, an inch here, an inch there, but I notice. I notice because I know this house as I know my own body, and when a chair is moved even slightly, I feel it the way I would feel a bone out of joint. The Monaciello is not just visiting. He is rearranging. I think he is making room. July 15, 1843. I found the dog in the wall. I cannot write more about this. I cannot. The entry for July 15 was the last legible one. The pages after it were either torn out or so badly stained, brown and black stains that might have been water damage or might have been something else, that the writing was illegible. The diary ended with a single phrase, scrawled in a hand that was no longer precise but shaky, desperate, the letters running together like people fleeing a fire. He does not bring gold, he brings the dead, and he wants a caretaker. Isabelle closed the diary. Her hands were shaking. The attic was silent around her, hot and dusty, and through the shutters she could see the Neapolitan sky, blue and harsh and indifferent. She sat for a long time, holding the book, and she thought about the gold coins, and she thought about the cistern in the basement, and she thought about her father crying in his study, and she thought about the bills stacked on his desk, and she thought about the palazzo crumbling around them, and she made a decision that she would regret for the rest of her life. She went downstairs to talk to her father. Chapter 3. Tommaso did not believe her at first. He sat behind his desk, his glasses low on his nose, and he listened to Isabelle's account of the diary with the weary patience of a man who has heard many desperate ideas for saving the family finances and has found them all wanting. "A ghost," he said. "You want me to believe that a ghost in the basement will give us gold?" "Not a ghost, Papa, a spirit, a Monaciello. It's a Neapolitan legend." "I know what a Monaciello is." Tommaso took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. "My grandmother used to tell me stories. A little monk, dressed in a dark robe, who lives in the cellars and brings luck to those who feed him. I thought it was a fairy tale." The diary says the gold was real. Gennaro took it to a jeweler. He confirmed it was ancient, valuable. Gennaro also wrote that he found the dog in the wall. Isabelle, did you read that part? She had. She had read it and reread it and tried not to think about what it meant, what it could possibly mean for a dog to be found in a wall, not behind a wall or beneath a wall but in it, as if the wall had grown around the animal, as if the plaster and the stone and the animal had become one thing. "I read it," she said, "but Papa, we are losing the house. The bank has given us until October, if we don't find the money." "I know," Tommaso's voice was quiet. "I know, Isabella, I know what happens in October." They sat in silence. The study was warm, too warm, the afternoon sun beating against the shutters, and the air smelled of old paper and grappa, and the faint, persistent smell of damp that had been part of the palazzo's character for as long as Isabelle could remember. Through the wall, she could hear the distant sound of water dripping. The cistern. It had been sealed for as long as anyone could remember, bricked over by Tommaso's grandfather, who had declared it a hazard and a relic of a less sanitary age. But it was still there, beneath the basement floor, a vast stone chamber that had once held the water supply for the entire palazzo, and the water that remained in it, brackish, stagnant, centuries old, still dripped and seeped and made itself known through the walls and floors, a constant reminder that the house had been built over something deeper. "What would we have to do?" Tommaso asked. Isabelle opened the diary to the relevant page. "According to Gennaro's account, we set a plate of food and some coins near the cistern, as an invitation. Then we wait. And if this Monaciello, accepts the invitation, then it brings gold. And if it doesn't—" Isabelle did not answer. She did not need to. They both knew the answer was that they would lose the palazzo, and losing the palazzo would mean losing everything. The history, the frescoes, the lemon trees, the last thread of the Moretti name. It would mean Tommaso moving into a small flat and Isabelle going to Milan to live with Marco and getting a job in an office and becoming another person. A person without a palazzo, a person without a past, and that thought was more frightening to her than any spirit. They set the plate that night. Isabelle prepared it carefully, following the diary's description as closely as she could. A thick slice of crusty bread, a small cup of red wine, a handful of dried figs and 3 modern coins, a €1 piece and 2 50-cent pieces, placed in a neat stack beside the bread. She carried the plate down to the basement, which was a place she had always disliked. The basement of the palazzo was not a proper cellar with wine racks and stone walls. It was older than that, much older, a low-ceilinged space with rough stone walls and a dirt floor, and it smelled of earth and moisture and the deep, mineral tang of underground water. The cistern was in the far corner, behind a brick wall that had been built over the original opening. The bricks were old and crumbling, and Isabelle could see, in the mortar between them, traces of green moss and black mold, and from behind the wall came the sound of water, not flowing water but standing water, the sound of a pool that had been still for centuries and was now, in the silence of the basement, just barely audible, a soft, rhythmic drip, like a slow heartbeat. She set the plate on the ground in front of the brick wall. She stood there for a moment, looking at the bread and the wine and the coins, and she felt foolish. She felt like a child leaving cookies for Santa Claus, and she almost laughed at herself, at the absurdity of a university-educated woman in the 21st century setting a plate of food for a fairy tale creature in the basement of a decaying palazzo. But then the dripping behind the wall changed. It had been a slow, even rhythm, drip, 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 but now it stuttered and then it stopped, and in the silence that followed, Isabelle heard something else. A sound like a small, wet mouth opening and closing, and then a click, a single click, like a tongue against a palate, and the sound was not coming from behind the wall. It was coming from above her. She looked up. The basement ceiling was low, barely 6 feet, and the floorboards of the ground floor above were visible, dark and old and warped, and between 2 of the boards, in a gap no wider than a finger, something moved. A thin, brown shape, like a fiber, like a thread of cloth, emerged from the gap and hung there, swaying gently, as if testing the air. Isabelle stared at it. It was the color of burlap. It was the color of the robe that Gennaro had described in his diary, the dark cowl of the Monaciello. She backed away. She did not turn around. Something in her, some primal instinct, told her not to turn her back on whatever was above her, and she backed up the stairs, 1 step at a time, watching the thread swaying in the gap between the floorboards, and just as she reached the top of the stairs, the thread withdrew, pulling back up into the ceiling with a speed that made her stomach lurch, and the dripping behind the brick wall resumed. She did not sleep that night. She lay in her bed and stared at the fresco on her ceiling, an 18th-century scene of angels and clouds and golden light, painted by an ancestor whose name she did not know, and she listened to the house around her. The palazzo was never silent, not truly. There were always sounds, the creak of old wood, the whisper of wind through the shutters, the distant drip of water from the cistern. But tonight the sounds were different. Tonight she heard footsteps. Not the slow, heavy footsteps of her father moving from his study to the kitchen and back. These were light, very light, the footsteps of something small, something that weighed less than a child, and they moved through the house with a familiarity that suggested the walker knew every room, every corridor, every turning. The footsteps went from the basement to the ground floor, from the ground floor to the first landing, from the first landing to the second, and then they were in the corridor outside Isabelle's bedroom, and they stopped. She held her breath. She could see the gap beneath her door, a thin line of yellowish light from the hallway lamp, and in that gap a shadow appeared. It was small. It was hunched. And it stayed there on the other side of her door for what felt like an hour but might have been a minute, and then the shadow moved and the footsteps retreated down the stairs, and Isabelle heard, very faintly, the sound of something being placed on a hard surface. A plate, a cup, the sound of bread being torn, the sound of wine being sipped. The Monaciello had accepted the invitation. Chapter 4. In the morning the plate was empty. The bread was gone, the wine was drunk, and the figs had disappeared. In their place, arranged in a neat, deliberate pile, were 7 gold coins. Isabelle found them when she went down to the basement at dawn, her hands trembling, her breath visible in the cool underground air. The coins were heavy, heavier than they should have been, heavier than any modern coin, and they were old. Not merely old, but ancient. They were stamped with a profile that Isabelle did not recognize. Not a Roman emperor, not a medieval king, but something else. Something that might have been a face or might have been a mask, with hollow eyes and a mouth that was open, as if caught in the middle of a word or a scream. The metal was gold, but it was a strange gold, darker than it should have been, with a reddish patina, as if the metal had been alloyed with something that was not copper, something that gave it the color of dried blood. She picked up the coins and held them in her palm, and they were warm. Not the warmth of something that has been in a heated room. These had been in the basement, which was always cold, but a different warmth, a biological warmth, the warmth of a living thing. She nearly dropped them. Instead, she wrapped them in a cloth and took them upstairs and showed them to her father. Tommaso examined the coins with the careful, methodical attention of a man who has spent his life handling objects of value. He weighed them. He held one up to the light. He bit into the edge of one, a habit he had picked up from his own grandfather who had been a jeweler, and the metal did not bend or flake. It was real. Gold, ancient, and worth, by his rough estimate, several thousand euros. 7 coins, he said. At a conservative valuation, that's enough to cover the electricity bill and the water bill, and perhaps the property tax installment for this quarter. We leave another plate tonight, Isabelle said. They did, and the next morning there were 9 coins, and the next night 11, and the next 14. The numbers were not consistent, they rose and fell in a pattern that Isabelle could not predict, but they were always gold, always ancient, always warm. Within a week they had enough to pay the bank's interest payment. Within 2 weeks they had enough to begin repairing the roof. Within 3, Tommaso's face had changed. The hollows in his cheeks had filled slightly, the squint had softened, and he moved through the palazzo with a step that was lighter, more confident, as if the weight of the house had been lifted from his shoulders and replaced with something that was, if not lighter, at least more bearable. The family was saved, the palazzo was saved, the Moretti name would endure. But the house was changing. At first, the changes were so subtle that Isabelle almost dismissed them. A door that she was certain she had locked was found open in the morning. A chair in the dining room had been moved, not moved across the room, not moved to a different part of the house, but shifted 2 inches to the left, so that its position relative to the table was slightly wrong, slightly off, in a way that only someone who had sat at that table every day for 23 years would notice. A painting in the hallway hung at an angle that was different from the angle it had hung at the day before. A rug in the living room had been straightened, or rather, it had been unstraightened, pulled slightly askew, so that its edge no longer aligned with the base of the sofa. Isabelle noticed these things because she was the kind of person who noticed them. She had grown up in the palazzo, and she knew its geometry the way a blind person knows the layout of their home, by feel, by instinct, by the accumulation of 1,000 small observations that form a mental map so precise that any deviation, however small, registers as a disturbance, like a wrong note in a familiar melody. And the deviations were multiplying. The changes were not random. Isabelle began to see a pattern, or rather, she began to see the absence of a pattern which was worse. The Monaciello was not moving things randomly, not rearranging furniture out of mischief or malice. It was reorganizing. It was taking the palazzo's architecture, the rooms, the corridors, the doors, the windows, and it was subtly, incrementally, night by night, shifting them. Not demolishing them, not tearing down walls, but moving them by inches, by centimeters, the way tectonic plates move, so slowly that you could not see the motion but only its result. And the result was that the house was becoming something other than what it had been. The hallway on the first floor, which had always been a straight corridor connecting the main staircase to the bedrooms, was no longer straight. Isabelle walked it one morning and found that it curved, very slightly, barely perceptible, but it curved, the walls leaning inward, the ceiling lowering by a fraction, so that by the time she reached the end, she felt as if she had walked through a tunnel rather than a hallway. The dining room, which had always been accessible through two doors, one from the kitchen, one from the hallway, now had only one. The second door was still there, its frame intact, its hinges visible, but when Isabelle opened it, she found not the hallway but a closet. A small, dark closet that she had never seen before, that should not have existed, that was not deep enough to be a real closet but was too deep to be a wall. She stared into it for a long time, and the closet stared back, and then she closed the door and did not open it again. The most disturbing change was in the basement. The brick wall that had sealed the cistern was changing. Not cracking, not crumbling, but thinning. The bricks seemed to be receding, as if they were being absorbed into the wall behind them, and the mortar between them was softening, becoming damp, becoming almost organic, like clay that had not yet dried. Isabelle pressed her hand against one of the bricks, and it gave slightly, not like a loose brick, but like a brick that had become something else, something softer, something that was in the process of becoming not a brick, of reverting to the material from which it had been made. She told her father. Tommaso listened, and his face, which had been softer and more hopeful in the weeks since the gold began to arrive, tightened again. It's an old house, Isabelle. Old houses shift. The foundations settle, the wood warps. The basement is stone, Papa. Stone doesn't warp. Tommaso had no answer for that. He sat in his study and he looked at the gold coins on his desk. There were dozens of them now, a small fortune in ancient metal, and he was quiet for a long time, and then he said, "We need the money, Isabella. Whatever is happening to the house, we need the money. Without it, we have nothing. We are nothing." Isabelle understood. She understood the way a person understands that the medicine they are taking has side effects, that the cure is also a poison, that the thing saving them is also the thing that is changing them. She understood, and she continued to set the plate in the basement every night, and every morning the gold appeared, and every night the house changed a little more, and the plate was always empty, and the coins were always warm. But then the coins began to smell. It started gradually, a faint odor that Isabelle noticed one morning when she picked up the day's offering from the basement floor. The coins had always smelled of metal, of old gold, of the deep earth from which they came. But this morning they smelled of something else, something organic, something that was, beneath the metallic tang, unmistakably the smell of rotting meat. She brought the coins to her nose and sniffed, and the smell hit her like a fist, thick, sweet, nauseating, the smell of flesh that has been left in a warm, wet place for too long. She gagged. She dropped the coins on the table and stepped back, and her father looked at her with alarm, and then he picked up one of the coins and smelled it, and his face went gray. "Where is this coming from?" he whispered. Isabelle thought about the tunnels beneath Naples, the vast, ancient network of underground passages and chambers that the city had been built on top of, carved from the soft tufa stone by the Greeks and the Romans, and expanded by every civilization that had come after. There were necropolises down there, catacombs, burial chambers, entire streets of the dead that had been sealed and forgotten, and the cistern beneath the palazzo connected to that network, or it had once before the brick wall was built. She thought about the coins, with their strange alloy and their reddish patina and their ancient provenance. She thought about where a spirit that lived in a cistern might find gold. And she understood with a horror that settled into her bones like a winter cold that the Monaciello was not creating gold from nothing. It was not conjuring wealth from the air. It was taking it from the graves below, from the dead who had been buried with their coins, their offerings, their small treasures in the tunnels that ran beneath the city like the roots of a tree. The Monaciello was a grave robber. It was stealing from the dead, and the gold it brought to the Moretti family was stained with the smell of corpses, because it had been resting against corpses for centuries, and the smell had seeped into the metal the way water seeps into stone, and it could not be washed away, and it could not be ignored, and it was the smell of the price they were paying for their salvation. The house changed faster now. The corridors twisted. The rooms shifted. The staircase that connected the ground floor to the first landing had developed a step that was not there before, an extra step, inserted between the third and fourth, slightly lower than the others, as if the staircase had grown a tumor. Isabelle tripped on it one night and fell, and as she lay at the bottom of the stairs, her ankle throbbing, she looked up and saw, in the shadow of the landing above, a small figure. It was no more than 3 feet tall. It was hunched. It wore a dark cowl that obscured its face, and the cowl was made of something that was not fabric, something brown and rough and fibrous, something that looked like burlap but moved like skin, and from beneath the cowl 2 eyes looked down at her. They were not human eyes. They were too large, too dark, and they did not reflect the light from the hallway lamp. They absorbed it. The figure raised one hand, a small hand, a brown hand, a hand that looked as if it had been wrapped in cloth, and it pointed at her. Not menacingly, not with anger or malice. It pointed the way a person points at an object they have found in a place where it does not belong, as if to say, "You, I see you, I know where you are, and I know where you should be." Then it was gone. Not gone as in it walked away or retreated or disappeared into a shadow. Gone as in it was simply not there, as if the space it had occupied had been emptied, as if the figure had been a stain on the air that had been wiped clean, and Isabelle was alone on the staircase, and the only sound was the dripping of the cistern far below and the creak of the house rearranging itself around her. The next morning the dog was gone. Chapter 5. The dog's name was Brutus. He was a Neapolitan mastiff, a massive, wrinkled, drooling beast with a broad chest and a jaw that could crush bone, but a temperament so gentle that Isabelle had once watched him allow a neighborhood toddler to climb on his back and pull his ears without so much as a grunt. Brutus had been in the family for 6 years, a gift from Isabelle's mother in the last year of her life, and he had become, in the years since her death, something more than a pet. He was a companion. He was a presence. He was the last living thing in the palazzo that remembered Lucia, and when he lay in the courtyard beneath the lemon trees, his great head resting on his paws, his eyes half closed, Isabelle sometimes sat beside him and stroked his wrinkles and felt, if not peace, then something close to it. He was gone on a Tuesday morning. Isabelle called for him in the courtyard, his usual spot, the patch of flagstone beside the dry fountain where the sun fell in the morning, and he did not come. She called again, louder, and then she walked through the ground floor of the palazzo, checking every room, every corridor, every corner where a dog of his size might curl up and sleep. She checked the kitchen, the dining room, the study, the living room. She checked the basement, which Brutus had always avoided, not disliked, not feared, but avoided, the way a person avoids a room that is too cold, that has a feeling about it that is not quite right. The basement was empty. The plate was licked clean. The coins were there, gleaming dully in the gray light, and they smelled of rot. She went upstairs. She checked her bedroom, her father's bedroom, the empty bedrooms that had belonged to Marco and Sophia. She checked the attic. She checked the bathrooms, the closets, the spaces behind doors. Brutus was nowhere. He was not in the house. He was not in the courtyard. He was not in the street outside, where she stood in her bare feet and called his name until her voice was hoarse, and the neighbors looked at her from their windows with expressions that were half curiosity and half pity. Tommaso called the neighbors. Isabelle walked the surrounding streets, calling, whistling, shaking a bag of treats. No one had seen the dog. A mastino of that size does not simply vanish, they said. Someone would have seen him, but no one had. It was as if the dog had walked out of the house and into a void, as if the street had opened and swallowed him, as if he had never existed at all. Isabelle came back to the palazzo in the late afternoon, defeated and afraid. She went through the ground floor one more time, and this time she walked slowly, carefully, paying attention not to the rooms but to the room's edges, the places where the walls met the floor, the corners where two walls joined, the seams where the plaster was cracked and the old stone showed through. She was looking for something. She did not know what, but she knew the Monaciello had been rearranging the house, and she knew that rearrangement could mean many things, and one of those things was that the house had new spaces in it, spaces that had not existed before, spaces that had been created by the shifting of walls and the compression of rooms, spaces that were hidden in the geometry of the palazzo like pockets in a coat. She found him at 7 o'clock in the evening, in the hallway on the ground floor. He was in the wall. Not behind the wall, not beneath the wall. In it. Brutus was part of the wall, his body merged with the plaster and the stone and the lath, his form visible beneath the surface the way a fossil is visible in rock. He was flattened, not the way a living thing is flattened by pressure, not crushed or broken, but spread, as if the dog's body had been pressed into the wall the way a leaf is pressed into the pages of a book, his mass distributed across a two-dimensional plane, his fur visible as a texture beneath a thin layer of plaster, his eye open, wet, clouded, staring from the wall like a window into another dimension. Isabelle screamed. She fell backward against the opposite wall and screamed again, and her father came running and he saw it, and he did not scream but he made a sound, a low guttural sound, like a man trying to vomit and breathe at the same time, and he put his hand against the wall, against the place where Brutus's flank was visible beneath the plaster, and the wall was warm, warm and slightly soft like skin. "We have to leave," Isabelle said. Her voice was flat, distant, as if it were coming from a great height. "We have to leave this house, Papa, now." Tommaso stared at the wall. His hand was still pressed against it, against the flattened body of the dog that had been his wife's gift, and his hand was trembling, and his face was the face of a man who has finally seen the thing he has been refusing to see, the thing he has been averting his eyes from, and now that he has seen it, he cannot unsee it, and the seeing of it has broken something in him that cannot be repaired. "The house is paid for," he whispered. "The bank, the debts, if we leave. If we stay, we die." Tommaso took his hand from the wall. He looked at his daughter, and his eyes were the eyes of a man standing at the edge of a cliff, looking down, calculating the distance, calculating the odds, and finding them both equally infinite. "We'll leave tomorrow," he said. "I'll pack tonight." But tomorrow did not come for Tommaso. That night, as Isabelle lay in her bed, listening to the sounds of the house, the creaking, the dripping, the soft, persistent sound of walls moving by fractions of a centimeter, she heard a new sound, a click. A wet, deliberate click from the corridor outside her door, and then another, and then a rapid, chittering sequence like a tongue against a palate, and then footsteps, small, light footsteps, moving not down the stairs but along the corridor, past her door, toward her father's room. She heard Tommaso's door open. She heard him say something, a word, a single word, she could not make it out, and then she heard the clicking again, and then the door closed, and the house was silent, and Isabelle lay in her bed and did not move and did not breathe and did not sleep. In the morning, her father was gone. Not gone as in he had left the house. Gone as in he was not in his room. His bed was made neatly, precisely, with the corners folded the way he always folded them, and his shoes were on the floor beside the bed, and his reading glasses were on the nightstand, and his wallet and keys were on the dresser, and everything was in its place, and the room was empty, and Tommaso Moretti was nowhere in the palazzo. Isabelle searched. She searched every room, every corridor, every closet, every space that the house's shifting architecture had created. She called his name until her voice cracked. She went to the basement and stood before the thinning brick wall and said, give him back, you monster." The wall did not answer. The dripping continued. The coins were there, a small pile of 11, warm and stinking of decay. She called Marco in Milan. She called Sofia in Rome. She called the police. The police came and searched the palazzo and found nothing. No body, no sign of struggle, no evidence of foul play. They noted the dog in the wall and looked at each other with the resigned expressions of men who have seen the madness of old houses before and have learned not to ask questions. They told Isabelle that her father might have wandered off, that people of his age sometimes did, that they would file a report and make inquiries. They left. Isabelle sat in the courtyard beneath the lemon trees and stared at the dry fountain and understood, with a clarity that was almost blinding, that she was alone. Chapter 6. It was her father's absence that forced Isabelle to confront the truth about the house. It was no longer a house. The Palazzo Moretti had been a home, a shelter, a structure with a logic and a geometry that could be understood and navigated. But the Monaciello had been at work for weeks now, shifting, compressing, rearranging, and the building had become something that Isabelle did not have a word for. It was a structure, yes. It had walls and floors and ceilings. But the relationship between those elements had been severed from the logic of architecture and rebuilt according to a logic that was not human, that did not share human assumptions about space and distance and the connection between rooms. The hallway that connected the kitchen to the dining room was now 40 feet long. It had been 12. Isabelle measured it. She walked it heel to toe, counting steps, and the corridor stretched before her like an airport runway, its walls converging slightly toward a vanishing point that should not have existed in a building that was only 20 meters wide. The dining room itself had shrunk. The table that had seated 12 now barely seated 4, the walls pressing inward like the interior of a bell, the ceiling so low that Isabelle could touch it without raising her arm. The living room had expanded to twice its original size, but it was no longer a rectangle. It was a shape with too many angles, a polygon with walls that met at degrees that made Isabelle's eyes water, and in one corner the wall did not meet the floor at all. There was a gap, a thin, dark gap, perhaps an inch wide, that ran the full length of the wall, and from that gap came a smell. The smell of water, the smell of earth, the smell of the deep tunnels beneath the city where the dead had been lying for centuries. Isabelle mapped the house. She took a notebook, her father's notebook from his study, still smelling of grappa and dust, and she walked every room, every corridor, every staircase, and she drew what she saw. It took her 3 days, because the house kept changing while she worked. A room she had measured on Monday was a different shape by Tuesday. A corridor that ran north-south on Wednesday ran east-west by Thursday. And the map she produced was not a floor plan but something closer to a diagram of a dream, with rooms that overlapped in corridors that doubled back on themselves and spaces that existed on one floor but opened onto another, as if the house had been folded like paper. But within the chaos, Isabelle found something. She found the original architecture. Not in the house as it was now, but in the house as it had been, in the bones of the building, in the load-bearing walls that even the Monaciello could not move without risking collapse, in the position of the windows, which still faced the street, even if the rooms behind them had changed, and the main staircase, which still rose from the courtyard to the first landing, even if the steps were wrong. She memorized the original layout, the layout she had known for 23 years, and she realized that the Monaciello's rearrangements, however bizarre, however non-Euclidean, were layered over the original architecture, not replacing it but obscuring it, the way a funhouse mirror obscures the room behind it. The real house was still there, underneath, and if you knew where to look, if you could remember the layout the way Isabelle remembered it, you could navigate the palazzo by the bones alone, ignoring the flesh the Monaciello had draped over them. She also realized with a growing, sickening certainty that the Monaciello was not doing this for its own comfort. It was not rearranging the house because it preferred a different layout. It was building something. The shifting corridors, the compressed rooms, the expanding spaces with too many angles, they were not random. They were structural. The Monaciello was turning the palazzo into an extension of the cistern, was building a labyrinth above the labyrinth below, was creating a structure that connected the surface to the depths, that funneled the living down into the dark where the dead lay in their ancient niches, their gold coins still warm against their bones. The house was a trap. It had always been a trap. The gold was bait. The food was a contract. And the Monaciello was not a spirit of luck or wealth. It was a custodian of the dead, a keeper, a tender, a thing that had lived in the cistern for centuries, feeding on the offerings of the desperate, and in return taking what it needed: bodies. Bodies to add to its collection, to prop up the tunnels, to serve as pillars in the endless, crumbling architecture of the underworld beneath Naples. The dog in the wall was not a punishment. It was a material, a test. The Monaciello had been testing the adhesive properties of its domain, seeing how flesh and plaster merged, how bone and stone could become one substance, and now it was ready for larger subjects. It was ready for people. Chapter 7. The dinner party had been planned for weeks, before the dog, before the coins began to smell, before Tommaso vanished. It was Sophia's idea, a small gathering of family and friends, a celebration of the Moretti Palazzo's rebirth, a thinly veiled attempt to reassert the family's social standing now that the bills were paid and the roof was being repaired. Isabelle had tried to cancel it, tried to reach Sophia, but Sophia, always imperious, always certain, had insisted that the party would proceed. She arrived from Rome on the appointed day with her husband, Carlo, and 3 friends, a banker named Renzo, a journalist named Valentina, and an elderly art historian named Professor Aldo Bianchi, who had once written a monograph on Neapolitan palazzi and had been eager to see the Moretti residence's frescoes. They arrived at 7. The palazzo was lit with candles. Isabelle had lit them deliberately, knowing that the electrical system, strained by the house's structural distortions, was unreliable. The candlelight gave the interior a golden, flickering warmth that masked, for a time, the wrongness of the architecture. The hallway was too long, but in the candlelight it looked merely grand. The dining room was too small, but in the candlelight it looked intimate. The living room had too many angles, but in the candlelight they looked architectural, deliberate, a feature rather than a flaw. Sophia was delighted. She moved through the palazzo with the confidence of a woman who has never been afraid of anything, touching the walls, admiring the frescoes, exclaiming over the candlelight and the flowers that Isabelle had placed on the table. Carlo, her husband, was quieter, a thin, nervous man who worked in finance and who had the perpetual expression of someone who has just received bad news but has not yet been told what it is. Renzo was boisterous and loud, the kind of man who fills silence with his own voice. Valentina was observant, her eyes moving constantly, cataloging details, a journalist's habit. And Professor Bianchi was old and slow and precise, his eyes magnified behind thick spectacles, his cane tapping the floor with the rhythm of a metronome. Isabelle served the meal. She had cooked it herself, simple Neapolitan dishes, pasta with tomato sauce, fried zucchini, a fish stew, and the guests ate and drank and talked, and for an hour, maybe 2, the palazzo felt almost like a home again. The conversation was lively. Renzo told jokes. Sophia described her life in Rome. Professor Bianchi discoursed on the history of the frescoes, his voice a low, pleasant rumble that filled the small dining room like the sound of distant thunder. Carlo picked at his food and said little. Valentina asked Isabelle about the family's finances, and Isabelle gave evasive answers, and the journalist's eyes narrowed, but she said nothing. It was during the second course, the fish stew, which Isabelle had seasoned with lemon from the courtyard trees, that the house made its move. It began with a sound, not the usual sounds, the creaking, the dripping, the soft moan of old stone. This was a new sound, a wet, slapping sound coming from beneath the dining room floor, and it was rhythmic and deliberate, and it grew louder as the guests fell silent, until the only sound in the room was the slapping and the soft, distant drip of the cistern below. "What is that?" Sophia asked. "Plumbing," Isabelle said, but her voice was too quick, too flat, and Valentina looked at her with an expression that said, "You're lying." The slapping stopped. The silence that followed was worse, thick, pressurized, the kind of silence that exists before an explosion. And then the clicking began. The wet, deliberate clicking that Isabelle had heard on the staircase, that she had heard outside her bedroom door, that she had heard the night her father vanished. It came from beneath the floor, and it was loud, not muffled by the stone and the wood, but amplified by them, as if the house itself were a speaker and the cistern were the source. And the clicking filled the dining room the way water fills a glass, rising, pressing against the walls, against the ears, against the mind. Carlo stood up. His chair scraped the floor, and the sound was shockingly loud in the silence, and he said, "I think we should leave." And he walked to the door of the dining room, and he opened it, and behind the door was not the hallway. Behind the door was a wall. A blank plaster wall, smooth and unbroken, with no doorframe, no hinges, no evidence that a door had ever existed there. Carlo stared at it. He put his hand against it. The plaster was warm and slightly soft, and beneath it he could feel something. Not stone, not wood, but something organic, something that pulsed faintly like a heartbeat. He tried the other door, the door to the kitchen. He opened it, and behind it was not the kitchen but a corridor. A long, narrow corridor that had not existed an hour ago, its walls converging toward a distant point, its ceiling low and close, its floor sloping gently downward, and from the far end of the corridor, from the darkness that swallowed the walls and the ceiling and the floor, came the smell of water and earth and decay. "That's not the kitchen," Valentina said. Her voice was calm, deceptively, professionally calm, the calm of a woman who has trained herself not to show fear. "Isabelle, what is happening?" Isabelle stood. She looked at the wall where the hallway door had been. She looked at the corridor where the kitchen had been. She looked at the windows, the two tall windows on the far side of the dining room, the ones that looked out onto the street, and what she saw there was worse than anything else. The windows were intact, the glass was clean, the shutters were open, but beyond the glass, beyond the shutters, there was no street, there was no sky, there was no Naples. There was only brown fabric, vast, close, textured like the inside of a bag, like the interior of a burlap sack, and the fabric stretched in every direction, up and down and left and right, and it was slightly transparent, and through it, dimly, Isabelle could see the lights of the city, street lamps. Headlights, the glow of apartment windows, but they were distant and distorted, as if the palazzo had been wrapped in cloth and lifted out of the world and placed somewhere else, somewhere that was not a place but a condition, a state of being enclosed, of being contained, of being held. The Monaciello had folded the house. "We are trapped," Isabelle said, and her voice did not shake because there was no room for shaking, no room for the luxury of fear. There was only the fact of the trap and the need to survive it. Chapter 8. Renzo did not believe it at first. He was a banker, a man whose entire worldview was built on the premise that everything could be quantified, negotiated, and controlled, and the idea that a house could be folded into a pocket of brown fabric was simply not in his vocabulary. He went to the windows and pounded on the glass. He went to the wall where the hallway door had been and felt the plaster and pushed against it. He went to the corridor where the kitchen had been and walked 10 paces into it, and then he stopped, because the corridor was getting narrower, and the ceiling was getting lower, and the floor was sloping more steeply, and somewhere ahead in the darkness, something was clicking. He came back, his face was white. "Isabelle," he said, "what is this?" "It's the Monaciello," she said. "It's a spirit. It lives in the cistern beneath the house. It's been changing the house for weeks, and now it's sealed us in." "That's insane," Sophia said. "Spirits don't exist. Houses don't get folded into whatever that is." She pointed at the window, at the brown fabric beyond the glass, and her hand trembled, and she withdrew it quickly, as if the proximity to the fabric had burned her. "I know what it looks like," Isabelle said. "I know how it sounds, but I've been living with this for weeks. It took the dog, it took my father, and now it wants us." Professor Bianchi, who had been sitting silently throughout this exchange, his magnified eyes moving between the wall, the corridor, and the window, cleared his throat. "The Monaciello," he said, his voice the low rumble of a man who has spent a lifetime acquiring knowledge that most people would never need. "I wrote about it in my monograph. Not the Moretti palazzo specifically, but the legend. It is one of the oldest stories in Naples, a fairy spirit of the cellar, the cistern, the underground. It is said to bring wealth to those who feed it and to take from those who do not." "It's taking from us," Isabelle said. "Indeed." The professor tapped his cane on the floor once, twice, 3 times, and then he looked at the floor as if listening for something. "The cistern, you said it is beneath us." "Beneath the basement, behind a brick wall." "And the brick wall, is it still intact?" "It's been thinning, the mortar is soft, the bricks are yielding." Professor Bianchi nodded. "Then the cistern is opening, and the spirit is no longer content with the basement. It is expanding its territory upward into the house, and it is using the house's own structure to do so. The walls, the floors, the ceilings, they are becoming extensions of the cistern, extensions of the Monaciello's body." "That doesn't help us get out," Carlo said. His voice was thin, strained, the voice of a man who is trying very hard to hold himself together and is aware that the effort is visible. "No," the professor agreed. "It doesn't, but it tells us something. The spirit is tethered to the cistern. The cistern is its anchor, its source. If we can reach the cistern, we may be able to sever the connection." "How?" Isabelle asked. The professor looked at her, and his magnified eyes were sad and old and filled with the particular grief of a man who has spent his life studying beautiful, terrible things and has finally met one in person. "I don't know," he said. "The legends don't say. The legends say the Monaciello brings gold and takes bodies. They don't say how to kill it. I'm not sure it can be killed." "Then what do we do?" Valentina asked. "We survive," Isabelle said. "We navigate the house. I know the original layout, the bones of the building, the structure that the Monaciello has been obscuring. If we move carefully, if we follow the original architecture and ignore the changes, we can find our way to the basement. And from there—" She stopped. From the corridor that had replaced the kitchen there came a sound, not the clicking, not the slapping, a voice. Small, thin, sweet, the voice of a child or something pretending to be a child. "Isabelle," it said. "Isabelle, come down, I have your father, he is safe, he is with me, come down and see." The voice was wrong. It was too high, too clear, too perfectly pitched, and beneath the sweetness there was a wet quality, a liquid resonance, as if the mouth that produced it were full of water. And it knew Isabelle's name. Sophia gasped. Carlo took a step backward. Valentina's hand went to her mouth. Professor Bianchi closed his eyes. "Don't listen to it," Isabelle said. "It uses voices. It takes the voices of the people it has taken and uses them to lure you. That's not my father. That's the Monaciello." "Isabelle," the voice said again, softer, closer. "I'm waiting, I have a plate for you, I have gold, come down." Renzo made a sound. A choked panic sound, and he turned and ran for the corridor. He did not run into it. He ran past it to the wall where the hallway door had been, and he pounded on the plaster with his fists, and the plaster gave beneath his hands, not cracking but denting like wet clay, like flesh. And from behind the wall came the wet, slapping sound, louder now, closer, and the wall began to bulge inward. The plaster stretching like skin over a swelling, and something beneath the surface pressed against it. Not a hand, not a finger, but something broader, something that spread across the wall like a tide, and the brown color of the fabric at the windows began to bleed through the plaster, staining it, claiming it. "Get away from the wall," Isabelle shouted, and she grabbed Renzo's arm and pulled him back, and the wall bulged further, and then it opened. Not cracked, not broke, but opened like a mouth, and from the opening came a smell so intense that everyone in the room staggered. The smell of rotting meat, of stagnant water, of ancient earth, of the deep places where the dead have lain for centuries without light or air or dignity. And from the opening, from the wet brown darkness, the Monaciello emerged. Chapter 9. It was 3 feet tall. It was hunched. It wore a dark cowl that covered its entire body, and the cowl was made of something that was not fabric and not skin but something between the two. A substance that was brown and rough and fibrous, like burlap, but that moved with the fluidity of living tissue, that rippled and shifted as the creature moved, as if the robe were breathing. Beneath the cowl, the face was visible, barely, in the candlelight, in the flickering gold, and it was a face that Isabelle would see in her nightmares for the rest of her life. It was small, it was round. It had the proportions of a child's face, but the skin was not skin. It was the same brown, fibrous material as the cowl, as if the face had been stitched from the same cloth, and the eyes were the worst part. They were large. They were dark. They were wet. They glistened in the candlelight like stones at the bottom of a pool, and they did not reflect the flames. They absorbed the light, swallowed it, and gave nothing back. The Monaciello stood in the opening in the wall and looked at the room. It looked at the 6 people standing in the dining room, the table still set, the candles still burning, the fish stew still warm in its bowl, and its wet, dark eyes moved from face to face with the slow, methodical attention of a collector examining specimens. Then it let out a sound, the clicking, a rapid, wet, chittering sequence that Isabelle had heard before, that she now understood was not a threat but a measurement. The Monaciello was measuring the room. It was measuring the people. It was calculating the space, the angles, the distances, the way a tailor measures a body before cutting cloth. And then the house folded. There was no other word for it. The walls moved. Not slowly, not gradually, not by the centimeters and millimeters that Isabelle had observed over the preceding weeks. The walls moved fast, and they moved in directions that walls should not move, upward, inward, sideways, folding at angles that were not right angles, that were not any angles, that were angles that existed only in the geometry of nightmares. The ceiling descended, the floor tilted, the dining room table slid sideways and crashed against a wall that had not been there a second ago. The candles fell. Some went out. Others rolled across the tilted floor, their flames guttering, casting mad, dancing shadows across the shifting surfaces. Sophia screamed. Carlo screamed. Renzo screamed. Valentina did not scream. She grabbed the edge of the table and held on, her jaw clenched, her eyes wide, her body rigid with the controlled terror of a woman who is determined not to die screaming. Professor Bianchi fell. His cane clattered away, and he lay on the tilting floor, his old body splayed, his spectacles askew, and he looked up at the ceiling as it descended toward him, and he said in a voice that was calm and clear and terrible, "It is not a house. It is a hand, and we are in its fist." The folding lasted perhaps 30 seconds. When it stopped, the dining room was gone. In its place was a space that Isabelle could not describe because it did not conform to any geometry she had been taught. The walls were not parallel. The floor was not flat. The ceiling was not above. It was beside, running along the left wall like a shelf, and the floor was curved like the inside of a bowl, and the room had no corners, no right angles, no junctions where two surfaces met. Everything was curved, everything was smooth, everything was brown, the same brown as the Monaciello's cowl, and the texture was the same, fibrous, rough, slightly damp, like the interior of a burlap sack. They were inside the robe. The Monaciello had folded the house into its own garment, and they were inside it. The six of them lay or sat or stood on the curved floor, which was not a floor but the inner surface of the fold, and the candlelight was gone, extinguished by the folding, and the only light came from a faint, biological luminescence that emanated from the walls themselves, a dim, brownish glow like the light of a deep cave, and in that light the Monaciello was visible. It stood at the center of the space, not on the floor, but in the floor, its body merged with the surface up to its waist, as if it were growing from the fabric of the room, as if the room were an extension of its body. It clicked. The sound was soft now, almost gentle, and it moved its head slowly, curiously, looking at each of the six humans in turn. Then it raised one small, brown hand and made a gesture. The gesture was simple. It beckoned. It said in the universal language of gesture that needs no translation, "Come here. Come to me. Let me look at you. Let me see what you are. Let me see how you are made." No one moved. The Monaciello clicked again, sharper, faster, with an edge of impatience, and the space shifted. The floor curved more steeply. The walls pressed inward. The six humans were pushed, gently, inevitably, the way a current pushes a swimmer toward the center, toward the place where the Monaciello stood half-merged with the fabric. Renzo broke. He was a banker, not a fighter, and the terror of the last 5 minutes had exceeded his capacity for rational response. He screamed, a raw animal sound, and he lunged for the nearest wall, clawing at the brown fabric, trying to tear it, to push through it, to find the world that he knew was on the other side. His fingers dug into the fibrous surface, and the surface gave, and for a moment he thought he was making progress, thought he was tearing through, and then his hands sank deeper into the fabric, and the fabric closed around them, and he could not pull them back. "Help me," he shouted. "My hands, I can't help me." Carlo ran to him and grabbed his shoulders and pulled, and Renzo's arms stretched, his skin, his muscles, his bones stretching like taffy, like warm dough, elongating as the fabric pulled him deeper, and Carlo let go and staggered back, his hands covering his mouth, and Renzo was pulled into the wall the way Brutus had been pulled into the wall. His body flattening, spreading, his face pressing against the fabric from the inside, his mouth open in a scream that no sound came from, and then he was part of the wall, his outline visible beneath the surface, his eyes wide and staring, his fingers splayed, frozen in the act of clawing, and the brown fabric rippled over him like water closing over a stone. The first kill took less than 10 seconds. Sophia fainted. Carlo caught her, held her, his body shaking. Valentina pressed herself against the curved wall, her eyes closed, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. Professor Bianchi lay on the floor, his eyes open, his mouth moving silently, and Isabelle stood in the center of the space and watched the place where Renzo had been and felt nothing. No grief, no horror, no shock. Only a cold, flat numbness that was the mind's way of protecting itself from information it cannot process. The Monaciello clicked. It was satisfied. It had learned what it wanted to know, that a human body could be absorbed into the fabric in approximately 9 seconds, that the compression was survivable for the first 4 seconds, and that the subject remained conscious throughout the process. It was data. It was measurement. The Monaciello was not cruel, it was curious. It wanted to know how much a human body could be compressed before it snapped, and it was going to find out. Chapter 10. The Monaciello took them one at a time. It was patient. It did not rush, did not force, did not chase. It simply waited, and the space waited with it, and the brown walls pressed and shifted and curved, and the light remained. The dim, biological glow that made everything look as if it were being viewed through the membrane of a closed eyelid. and the survivors huddled together in the center of the space and watched the walls, and the walls watched them back. Carlo was next. He lasted an hour. Sophia was unconscious, lying on the curved floor, her breathing shallow, her face slack, and Carlo held her hand and whispered to her, soft, meaningless words of comfort that were really words of comfort for himself, because he could not bear the silence and the clicking and the brown walls that breathed. He held her hand and he whispered, and then the floor beneath him shifted. It was a small shift, a centimeter, maybe less, but it was enough to break his concentration, and he looked down, and he saw that the floor was no longer beneath him. It was around him. The fabric had crept up over his knees while he was not looking, had crawled up his thighs while he was whispering, had risen over his hips while he stared, and now it was at his waist, and it was warm and soft and intimate, like a blanket being drawn up by a careful hand, and Carlo understood that he was being tucked in. He screamed. He let go of Sophia's hand and clawed at the fabric, trying to push it down, trying to free his legs, but the fabric was adhesive. It held his fingers, it held his palms, it held his wrists, and the more he struggled, the more he touched, and the more he touched, the more he was held. He twisted and thrashed, and the fabric rose over his chest, and Isabelle could hear his ribs creak, not breaking but flexing, the bones bending under the compression, and Carlo's eyes were wide and wet and staring at her. And he said, "Isabelle, please," and the fabric rose over his shoulders and over his neck, and he tilted his head back to keep his mouth above the surface. Like a man drowning in a rising tide, and the fabric rose over his chin and his mouth, and the last thing visible was his eyes, wide, terrified, looking at nothing. And then he was gone, and the surface was smooth and brown and still. And somewhere inside it, Carlo was still conscious, still aware, still feeling, and the Monaciello clicked softly, almost tenderly, and moved on. Sophia never woke up. The fabric took her while she was unconscious, drawing her down into its surface the way mud draws down a stone, slowly, gently, without struggle. And when Isabelle looked, her sister was gone, her outline barely visible beneath the brown surface, her face calm and sleeping, and Isabelle was grateful in a way that she hated herself for, that Sophia had not been awake to feel it. Valentina fought. She was not a large woman, but she was fast and she was smart, and when the fabric began to creep toward her, she did not touch it. She pulled off her jacket and laid it on the floor as a barrier, and she stood on the jacket, and when the fabric crept over the edges of the jacket, she pulled off her second layer, a blouse, and laid it down, and she stood on that, and she looked at Isabelle and said, "How do we get out of here?" "Follow me," Isabelle said. "I know the house, the bones of the house. I can find the way down." "Down?" "To the cistern. The spirit is tethered to the cistern. If I can reach it, I can break the connection." "Can you?" Isabelle did not answer. She did not know. But she knew that staying here was death and moving was not, and the difference between death and not death was sometimes enough. Professor Bianchi was sitting on the floor, his back against the curved wall, his spectacles in his hand. He had removed them, and without them, his eyes were large and vague and unfocused, and he looked like a very old man in a very large space. And his voice, when he spoke, was the voice of a scholar who has finally encountered the subject of his scholarship and found it to be exactly as terrible as he had always suspected. "Isabelle," he said, "the cistern, the diary. Gennaro wrote that the spirit wants a caretaker. Did he write anything else? Anything about how to stop it?" Isabelle thought. She had read the diary so many times that the words were printed on the inside of her eyelids. He does not bring gold, he brings the dead. And he wants a caretaker. That was the last entry. But there had been something else, something she had almost missed, a note scrawled in the margin of the July 3rd entry in the same shaky hand as the final message, a single line. "The mirror, show him what he is." "The mirror," Isabelle said. "Gennaro wrote about a mirror. If I can show the Monaciello its own reflection." "A mirror," the professor repeated. "Of course. The fairy lore is full of mirrors. Mirrors reveal true forms. They are the one thing that spirits cannot bear because they show the spirit what it has become, and spirits are, by their nature, in denial of their own existence. Then I need a mirror. Valentina reached into her bag, a journalist's bag, always prepared, always equipped, and pulled out a small compact mirror. She held it up. It was tiny, 2 inches across, barely larger than a coin, but it was real glass and it was reflective, and it was the only mirror in the space. "Will this work?" Valentina asked. "It has to," Isabelle said. The Monaciello was watching them. It stood in its half-merged position at the center of the space, and its wet, dark eyes moved between Isabelle and Valentina and the professor, and it clicked, not the rapid, measuring clicks of before, but slow, deliberate clicks, like a clock counting down. It knew they were planning something. It did not care. It had all the time in the world. It had been in the Cistern for centuries, and it would be in the Cistern for centuries more, and these humans, with their small plans and their tiny mirrors, were temporary, were transient, were a moment's entertainment in the long, dark patience of its existence. The fabric began to move again. It crept toward the professor slowly, almost shyly, the way a vine creeps toward a wall, and Bianchi watched it come, and he put his spectacles back on, and he stood slowly with the effort of an old man whose joints have stiffened, and he looked at Isabelle and said, "Go, now, while it is focused on me." "Professor, I am 81 years old, Isabelle. I have lived a long life and I have studied many things, and if this is the last thing I study, I will consider my education complete." He looked at her, and his magnified eyes were clear and calm and filled with a courage that was not the absence of fear but the decision to act in spite of it. "Go, find the cistern, show it the mirror, and run." The fabric reached his shoes. It began to climb. The professor did not look down. He looked at Isabelle and he nodded, and Isabelle grabbed Valentina's hand and they ran. Chapter 11. The space opened before them. Or rather, it was open, in a way that defied the logic of rooms and corridors. The Monaciello's fold was not a building. It was not a maze. It was a landscape of brown fabric and curved surfaces, of walls that rose and fell like dunes, of corridors that spiraled inward and outward simultaneously, of spaces that expanded when you approached them and contracted when you retreated. There was no floor plan. There was no map. There was only the fabric stretching in every direction and the dim glow that came from the walls themselves, and the sound of clicking, distant and persistent, like the heartbeat of the space. But Isabelle knew the bones. She stopped running and closed her eyes. She breathed. She pictured the palazzo, not the palazzo as it was now, not the folded nightmare of brown fabric and non-Euclidean geometry, but the palazzo as it had been. The palazzo she had known for 23 years, the courtyard with the lemon trees, the main staircase with its marble steps, the first-floor corridor, straight and wide, with the bedrooms on either side, the ground floor, with the dining room and the living room and the study and the kitchen, the basement, with its stone walls and its dirt floor and the brick wall that sealed the cistern. The bones, the structure that could not be moved, the load-bearing walls, the foundations, the positions of the windows and doors that were cut into the external walls, and that the Monaciello could not erase because to do so would be to tear the house from the street, to sever it from the world entirely, and the Monaciello did not want that. It wanted the house connected to the world. It needed the house connected to the world because the house was its lure, its trap, its doorway to the living, and a doorway with no door is useless. Isabelle opened her eyes. She looked at the fabric around her and she saw, not with her eyes but with her memory, with the map she had drawn in her father's notebook, with the 23 years of walking these rooms and corridors, the bones beneath the fabric. There, the main staircase. It was still there, beneath the fold, its marble steps still descending from the first floor to the ground floor, and the fabric that covered it was thinner here, more translucent, as if the Monaciello's power was weaker over the structural elements of the house, as if the bones resisted the fold. She pulled Valentina toward it. The floor beneath them was soft, not the hard marble of the staircase but the yielding fabric of the fold, and Isabelle kicked at it, and her foot went through, and beneath the fabric was the marble. Cold, hard, real. She grabbed Valentina's arm and pulled her through the tier, and they were standing on the staircase. The real staircase, the marble staircase, half buried in brown fabric but still navigable, still descending. And Isabelle ran down the steps, and Valentina ran behind her, and the fabric tore around them like cobwebs in an abandoned house, and the clicking grew louder, more urgent, because the Monaciello had noticed. The house fought them. The fabric surged up the staircase behind them, closing the tier, sealing the breach and the walls of the staircase. Real walls, plaster and stone, the walls that Isabelle had known all her life, began to warp, the plaster softening, the stone yielding, the bones themselves beginning to bend under the Monaciello's will. But they did not break. They bent, they warped. They complained with the groan of ancient materials under stress. But they held, and Isabelle and Valentina descended, and the fabric pursued them. And the clicking grew louder, and the space itself seemed to scream. A high, thin, keening sound that was not a voice but a vibration. The vibration of fabric stretched to its limit, of a space that was trying to hold everything and was failing. They reached the ground floor. The dining room was gone, absorbed into the fold, its walls part of the fabric, its ceiling part of the space above, and Isabelle did not look at it. She looked for the basement door, the narrow door beneath the staircase that led down to the stone-walled cellar, and she found it, not where it should have been, not in the position she remembered, but 3 meters to the left, shifted by the Monaciello's rearrangement. And she found it by the bones, by the position of the load-bearing wall that flanked it, by the knowledge that was deeper than geometry, deeper than memory, the knowledge of a body that has walked a house 1,000 times and knows its shape the way a tongue knows the shape of a mouth. The door was there. The fabric covered it but thinly, so thinly that Isabelle could see the wood through it, the dark old wood with its iron handle and its cracked paint, and she clawed at the fabric and it tore, and she pulled the door open, and behind it was the basement. Not the fold, not the fabric. The real basement, stone walls, dirt floor, the smell of earth and water and the deep mineral tang of the underground. And the cistern. The brick wall was gone. The bricks were not demolished, not removed. They were dissolved, their substance absorbed into the fabric, their matter repurposed, and in the place where the wall had been was an opening. A dark, wet, breathing opening the size of a door cut into the stone leading down, down into the cistern, down into the ancient, sealed chamber that had held the palazzo's water for centuries, that connected to the tunnels beneath Naples. That was the Monaciello's home, its lair, its anchor, its body. From the opening came the smell of water and decay and the sound of dripping, not the slow, rhythmic drip that Isabelle had heard for weeks, but a faster, louder sound, as if the cistern were full, as if the water were rising, as if the chamber below were overflowing with something that was not water but that behaved like water, that sounded like water, that smelled like the dead. "We have to go down," Isabelle said. Valentina looked at her. The journalist's face was pale, drawn, her eyes wide, her breath coming in short, sharp bursts, and she held the compact mirror in her hand like a weapon, and she said, "If this doesn't work." "It will work. If it doesn't, then we die, but we die moving, not standing still." Valentina nodded. They went down. Chapter 12. The cistern was vast. Isabelle had expected a small chamber, a few meters across, a stone tank, a sealed pool. What she found was a cathedral. The cistern was a domed chamber, carved from the tufa stone beneath the palazzo, its ceiling vaulted, its walls rough and damp and glistening with moisture, its floor a shallow pool of black water that reflected the nothing above. It was 30 meters across, perhaps more. The walls were lost in darkness, and the only light came from the opening they had descended through, a faint gray rectangle that grew smaller and dimmer as they moved away from it. and from a faint, phosphorescent glow that emanated from the water itself, a sickly, greenish light that turned the chamber into an aquarium of shadows. The water was not deep, at least not at the edges. It lapped at their ankles, cold and black and still, and the floor beneath was not stone but mud, thick, viscous, sucking at their shoes with each step as if the floor itself were trying to hold them. And in the mud in the shallows at the edge of the cistern, there were shapes. Isabelle saw the first one and stopped. It was a human form, or it had been once. It was standing upright, its feet buried in the mud, its body covered with a crust of mineral deposit, a thick gray-white layer of calcium and sediment that had built up over years, decades, centuries of immersion in the water. The form was a pillar. It was holding up the ceiling. The arms were raised above the head, the hands splayed against the vaulted stone, and the body was rigid, calcified. The skin and the bone and the mineral merged into a single substance, and the face was visible beneath the crust, barely in the greenish light, and the face was screaming. The mouth was open. The eyes were wide. The expression was frozen in an eternity of terror, and the body had been there for so long that it was no longer a body but a structure, a load-bearing element of the cistern's architecture, a human being who had been absorbed into the building and made to serve as a pillar. There were dozens of them. As Isabelle's eyes adjusted to the darkness, she could see them, standing in rows, their feet in the mud, their arms raised, their bodies sheathed in mineral crust, their faces frozen in expressions of horror and agony, and the particular, specific despair of a person who has been buried alive in stone and is aware of it, and has been aware of it for a very, very long time. They lined the walls of the cistern, standing shoulder to shoulder, their mineralized bodies forming a colonnade, and above them, the vaulted ceiling rested on their heads, and the weight of the palazzo above, the weight of the city above, rested on their mineralized, screaming shoulders. These were the caretakers. These were the people the Monaciello had taken over the centuries, the desperate, the greedy, the foolish, the unlucky, and they had not been killed. They had been preserved. Kept alive, in some diminished mineral way, their consciousness trapped in their calcified bodies, serving as the structural support for the tunnels and chambers beneath the city, and the Monaciello tended them the way a gardener tends stakes, ensuring they were upright, ensuring they were bearing weight, ensuring they were doing their job. And among them, near the far wall of the cistern in the deepest part of the chamber, where the water was black and the mud was thickest, Isabelle saw a new addition, a form that was not fully mineralized, not yet, a form that still had skin, still had color, still had the texture of recent life. It was a man. He was standing in the mud, his feet buried, his arms being slowly raised by the growing crust, and his face was turned toward the opening through which Isabelle had entered, and his mouth was moving, and no sound came out, but the shape of the words was visible in the greenish light, and the words were, "Run." It was her father. Isabelle screamed his name. She lunged forward, splashing through the shallow water, her feet sinking in the mud, and Valentina grabbed her arm and held her back, and Isabelle fought her, and Valentina held on and said, "Isabelle, look at him. Look, he's already being taken." And Isabelle looked, and she saw that it was true. Tommaso's legs were already encased in the mineral crust, the gray-white shell creeping up his thighs, and his arms were being lifted by the growing deposit, the crust forming over his hands and fingers like a glove, and his eyes were open and aware, and filled with a desperate, terrible love, and his mouth kept forming the word "run" over and over, and Isabelle understood that he was not calling for help. He was not begging to be saved. He was telling her to leave. He was using the last seconds of his freedom, his last seconds of mobility, before the crust claimed his torso and his neck and his face, to tell his daughter to run because he knew what the cistern was, and he knew what the Monaciello was, and he knew that Isabelle's only chance was to act now, while the Monaciello was focused on the kill, while its attention was on the new caretaker being installed. Isabelle stopped fighting. She looked at her father, and she mouthed the words "I love you," and Tommaso's eyes, still free, still human, still his, shone with a grief that was deeper than the cistern. And then the crust rose over his chin, and his mouth stopped moving, and his face froze in an expression that was no longer terror but acceptance. And Isabelle turned away, and the tears on her face were cold, and the water around her ankles was cold, and the air in the cistern was cold, and everything was cold except the mirror in Valentina's hand, which was warm. Chapter 13. The Monaciello was at the center of the cistern. It stood in the black water, not on the surface but in it, the water reaching its waist, its dark cowl spreading across the surface like an oil slick, its brown, fibrous body merged with the water and the mud and the stone. It was larger here than it had been in the dining room, not 3 feet tall but 6, maybe more, its body swelling with the proximity to its source, its cowl expanding, its presence filling the chamber like a sound fills a room. Its eyes were larger, too, dark, wet, vast, like pools of standing water, and they were fixed on Isabelle, and the clicking was constant now, a continuous, rapid, wet chittering that filled the cistern with a sound like rain on a tin roof, and the mineralized caretakers vibrated with it, their crust-covered bodies trembling as the Monaciello's frequency passed through them. Isabelle could see what it was wearing, not the cowl. The cowl was its body, its garment, its skin. But on its head, beneath the hood of the cowl, it wore a cap. A small black cap, like the cap of a priest, like the cap of a mourner, and Isabelle remembered with a jolt of terror that ran through her like electricity what the diary had said about the Monaciello's cap. Gennaro had not written about it, but the folklore had, and Isabelle had read the folklore, had read it late at night in her bedroom with her laptop and her desperate, academic need to understand what she was dealing with. The lore said, if the Monaciello wears a red cap, it brings luck. If it wears a white cap, it brings a gift. If it wears a black cap, it brings death. The Monaciello was wearing a black cap. It had chosen its cap for this occasion, and the cap was not fabric. It was the same fibrous brown-black material as the cowl, and it sat on the creature's head like a crown, and it meant that Isabelle and Valentina were not guests. They were not visitors. They were not even prey. They were candidates. Candidates for the caretaker position. Candidates for the mineral crust. Candidates for the colonnade of the screaming dead that lined the walls of the cistern and held up the city above. Isabelle looked at Valentina. Valentina looked at Isabelle. The mirror was in Valentina's hand, tiny, 2 inches across, reflecting the greenish light of the cistern, reflecting the dark water and the mineralized bodies and the vast, hunched form of the Monaciello in its black cap. "Give me the mirror," Isabelle said. Valentina handed it over. Isabelle held it in her palm. It was warm, the only warm thing in the cistern, warm as the coins had been warm, warm as the Monaciello's fabric was warm, and she closed her fingers around it, and she began to walk toward the creature. The clicking changed. It slowed, became questioning, curious, interested. The Monaciello tilted its head, its wet, dark eyes tracking Isabelle's approach, and the water rippled around its body, and the caretakers trembled, and the cistern held its breath. Isabelle stopped 3 meters from the creature. She could smell it, not the rot, not the decay, but something else, something beneath those smells, something old and mineral and deep, the smell of the earth itself, the smell of the tunnels beneath Naples, the smell of the place where the city's dead had been laid to rest for 3,000 years. She could see the texture of its cowl, the fibers, the threads, the way they moved and shifted, and she realized with a clarity that was almost peaceful that the cowl was not a garment. It was a collection. Every fiber was a thread taken from a victim, a piece of clothing, a strand of hair, a strip of skin, and the Monaciello wore them all, wove them into its body, made itself a patchwork of the people it had taken, and it was beautiful in the way that a cancer is beautiful under a microscope, complex, intricate, purposeful, and utterly without mercy. "Isabelle," it said, not in the voice of her father, not in the voice of a child. in its own voice, which was the sound of water in a stone chamber, the sound of mud settling, the sound of fabric being torn, and beneath all of that, very faintly, the sound of a nursery rhyme, hummed by something that does not have lips. "O Monaciello, O Monaciello." "I know what you want," Isabelle said. Her voice was steady. She did not know how, but it was. "You want a caretaker. You want someone to tend the cistern, to tend the dead, to keep the pillars standing." The Monaciello clicked. "Yes. I'm not going to be your caretaker." The Monaciello clicked again. The water rippled. The caretakers trembled. The black cap seemed to darken. Isabelle opened her hand. The mirror was there, small, bright, reflecting the greenish light, reflecting the Monaciello's face, reflecting the wet, dark eyes, the fibrous brown skin, the black cap, the vast, hunched, terrible form of a thing that had lived in the dark for so long that it had forgotten what it looked like, that had never seen itself, that had no idea what it had become. She held it up. The Monaciello looked at the mirror. Its wet, dark eyes focused, slowly, with the effort of a creature that has not used its eyes in centuries, that has navigated by sound and touch and the taste of the air, and it saw itself. And for a fraction of a second, a heartbeat, a breath, a single click of its wet, chittering tongue, the Monaciello was still. It saw itself, not as it imagined itself, not as a bringer of gold, not as a keeper of the dead, not as a spirit of the house, a fairy of the cellar, a legend of the city. It saw itself as it was, a small, brown, fibrous thing, hunched and wet and deformed, wearing a crown of death, standing in a pool of black water surrounded by the calcified bodies of the people it had taken, holding up a city of the dead with the corpses of the living. It saw the mineral crust on the caretakers. It saw the screaming faces. It saw the colonnade of the damned. It saw in the tiny mirror the totality of its own horror, and the seeing of it was a wound deeper than any physical injury, because it was a wound of identity, a wound of self, and the Monaciello, ancient, patient, terrible, was not prepared for it. The fabric screamed, not the thin, keening sound from before. This was a full, deep, resonant scream, the sound of every fiber in the cowl vibrating at once, the sound of every thread of every victim crying out in sympathetic horror, and the space broke. The fold tore. The brown fabric that had wrapped the palazzo, that had sealed the windows, that had compressed the rooms, that had absorbed Renzo and Carlo and Sofia, it tore, and through the tear, Isabelle could see the real world. The basement, the stone walls, the dirt floor, the opening to the cistern, and beyond it, up the stairs, through the door, the hallway, the courtyard, the street. Naples, the night, the rain, the real world. Isabelle ran. She did not look back. She splashed through the shallow water, her feet sinking in the mud, her hand clutching the mirror, and behind her the cistern was collapsing. Not the stone, not the structure, but the fold, the Monaciello's fabric, its body, its domain, all of it unraveling, coming apart. The threads of 1,000 victims releasing, and the caretakers, the mineralized, screaming caretakers, were falling, their pillars gone, their structural purpose ended, and the ceiling of the cistern groaned, and the stone cracked, and the palazzo above began to shake. Valentina was ahead of her, already at the opening, already climbing, already through, and Isabelle was right behind her, and the water was rising. Not water, mud, thick black mud, the mud of the tunnels, the mud of the dead, rising from the floor of the cistern as the chamber collapsed, as the earth reclaims what was taken from it, as the city above settles into the void below. Isabelle grabbed the edge of the opening and pulled herself up, and the mud grabbed her ankles, and she kicked, and the mud released, and she was through, and she was in the basement, and the basement was shaking, the stone walls cracking, the dirt floor splitting, and she ran for the stairs, and Valentina was at the top, and Isabelle was behind her, and the house was coming down. They burst through the door into the ground floor, and the ground floor was itself again. The real walls, the real floors, the real geometry of a house that has been returned to itself by the destruction of the thing that possessed it. And the windows were clear. the brown fabric gone, and through the windows Isabelle could see the street. The rain, the lights of Naples, the real world, and she ran for the front door, and Valentina was already outside, and Isabelle grabbed the handle and pulled, and the door opened, and she was outside, and the rain hit her face, and the air was cold and clean and real, and behind her, the Palazzo Moretti was collapsing. It did not explode, it did not crumble, it sank. The foundations gave way, and the building, 5 stories of stone and plaster and fresco and history, descended into the earth, the ground opening beneath it like a mouth, the floors folding down one on top of another, the walls falling inward, the roof descending, and the sound was not a crash but a groan, a deep structural geological groan, the sound of a building being swallowed by the thing beneath it, and the street cracked and the cobblestones heaved, and the neighboring buildings shuddered, and then it was over. The palazzo was gone. In its place was a hole, a ragged, irregular hole, perhaps 20 meters across, its edges crumbling, its depth unknown, and from the hole came the smell of earth and water and the deep, mineral tang of the underground, and somewhere far below, faintly, Isabelle could hear the sound of water dripping. She stood in the rain. Valentina stood beside her. They were soaked, they were filthy, they were alive. The street was filling with people, neighbors, passers-by, the eternal, curious, indomitable population of Naples, emerging from their buildings in their nightclothes to stare at the spectacle of a palazzo that had been standing for 3 centuries and was now a hole in the ground. Someone called the fire department, someone called the police, someone was crying, someone was praying. The rain fell and the hole steamed and the night was cold. Isabelle walked away. She did not wait for the police. She did not give a statement. She did not answer questions. She walked through the rain, through the narrow streets of the old city, past the shuttered shops and the lit windows and the life of a city that has survived eruptions and earthquakes and wars and plagues, and will survive this, too, because Naples is a city that has been built on the dead for 3,000 years and has never been afraid of what lies beneath. She walked, and the rain washed the mud from her legs and the tears from her face, and she did not look back. She was halfway to her apartment, a small flat she had rented years ago, a place she had never used, a contingency she had forgotten about until this night, when she felt it. A tug, a small physical tug on the hem of her coat, as if a child had grabbed the fabric and was pulling, gently, insistently, the way a child pulls its mother's hand. She stopped, she looked down, there was no one there, the street was empty, the rain fell. She put her hand in her coat pocket and her fingers touched something small, round, warm. She pulled it out. It was a gold coin. Ancient, heavy, stamped with a face she did not recognize, a face with hollow eyes and an open mouth, a face that might have been a mask or might have been a scream. It was warm in her palm and it smelled, not of rot, not anymore, but of something else, something clean and mineral and deep. The smell of the cistern, the smell of the earth, the smell of the Monaciello's home. She threw it. She threw it as hard as she could, into the rain, into the gutter, into the running water that carried it away, down the street, down the drain, down into the underground where it belonged. She watched it go, and she kept walking, and she did not put her hand in her pocket again. She reached her apartment. It was on the 3rd floor of a building on the other side of the city, a building that had nothing to do with the Moretti family, that had no cistern, no basement, no connection to the tunnels beneath Naples. She climbed the stairs, her legs aching, her feet blistered, her mind blank with the particular blankness that follows catastrophe, the blankness that is not peace but the absence of the capacity to feel. She unlocked her door. She stepped inside. She closed the door behind her. The apartment was dark. She did not turn on the light. She walked to the bedroom and she stood in the doorway and she looked at her bed, neat made, the pillow fluffed, the blanket folded. And on the pillow, lying across the white cotton like a scar on a clean face, there was a single thread. It was brown, it was rough, it was fibrous, it was the color of burlap. It was the length of a finger, and it lay across the pillow in a gentle curve, and it was warm. And when Isabelle touched it, gently with the tip of one finger, the way you touch a wound to see if it still hurts, it was soft and slightly damp, like a living thing, and it moved. Just barely, just a fraction of a millimeter. A twitch, a pulse, a whisper of motion that was not the wind and was not the building settling and was not her imagination. It was a message. It was a calling card. It was a thread from the robe of the Monaciello, left on her pillow in her apartment, in a building that had no connection to the cistern or the tunnels or the palazzo that had been swallowed by the earth, and it meant one thing and one thing only. I know where you live. Isabelle stared at the thread for a long time. The rain drummed against the window. The city hummed beyond the glass, traffic and voices and music, and the 10,000 sounds of a city that has been alive for millennia and does not stop. She stared at the thread, and the thread lay on her pillow, warm and brown and patient, and Isabelle understood that the story was not over. That the Monaciello was not dead. It could not be killed, because it was not alive in the way that things are alive. It was a condition of the water and the stone and the earth. It was a feature of the city, as permanent as the tunnels and the dead and the weight of history that pressed down on Naples from above and below. She understood that the gold coin in her pocket had not been a gift. It had been a seed, a tether. A thread of a different kind, a thread of warmth and metal and the smell of the deep earth, and she had thrown it away, and the Monaciello had found it, or it had found the Monaciello, or it had never left, and now there was a thread on her pillow, and the thread was warm, and the rain was falling, and somewhere beneath the city, in the tunnels that ran like veins through the tufa stone, in the cisterns that had been sealed and forgotten and opened again, something was clicking. Softly, patiently, measuring the distance. Isabelle did not touch the thread again. She did not remove it. She did not turn on the light. She stood in the doorway of her bedroom and listened to the rain and the city and the silence beneath both, and she understood that safety was a word that no longer applied to her, that the world she had known, the world of frescoes and lemon trees and palazzi and family, was gone, swallowed by the earth, and the world that remained was one in which a brown thread on a white pillow was the most terrifying thing she had ever seen. She picked up the thread. She held it between her thumb and forefinger. It was warm and it pulsed faintly like a heartbeat, and it pulled, gently, insistently toward the floor, toward the ground, toward the earth beneath the building, beneath the street, beneath the city, where the water was dark and the tunnels were deep and the Monaciello was waiting, patient as stone, for its caretaker to come home. Isabelle dropped the thread. She picked up her pillow and her blanket and she walked to the living room and she lay down on the sofa and she did not sleep, and the rain fell and the city lived, and beneath it all in the dark something clicked and clicked and clicked, and the distance it measured was getting smaller. Thank you for listening to today's stories. If you enjoyed, please leave a like and subscribe so you don't miss the stories yet to come.